Good morning, good morning, good morning. Is everybody there?
Good morning.
How is everybody today?
Good morning. Good.
Good
Good.
morning.
Good.
We're doing pretty good.
Fantastic, fantastic. We all survived another week of the pandemic. That's always good news. I understand there's a new strain in the UK. Have you guys heard about that?
Haven't come across that one as yet.
You haven't heard that one yet?
Not as yet. No. There's been so many, it's too much to keep up with.
Absolutely, absolutely. It makes the whole thing even more intriguing, for want of a better word.
Agreed.
But apparently now they're saying that there's a new strand in the UK called COV2 something. And according to the Prime Minister of the UK, Mr. Johnson, by the way, speaking about Johnson, since we're all going to be KYC people in one form or another anyway, now or in the future, the name Johnson happens to be a UK name. And if you're wondering why we have so many Johnsons in the Bahamas, when you have nothing to do, you do a little research, you'll find out, like so many other names in the Bahamas, that they are names of our former colonial masters. So don't be surprised if you didn't know that. Many of our surnames are from our former colonial people. Johnson is one of them. Wilkinson, like my own, is one of them. Smith is one of them. And there are many, many more that came from back in the day. I know that doesn't sound like AML. I thought that was interesting. But Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, says because of that, the UK will not be opening on June 21st anymore. They've set a new date for July 19th. So they're going to be closed again for another month or so. They say they believe this new strain came from somewhere in India. How about that? And I guess since so many Indians are in the UK, who knows how this whole thing happened. All right, so we're not out of the woods yet, apparently. It keeps getting more interesting by the day. All right, so let's see who's present today. Thank God we're all here in one piece. I had a gentleman I was waiting to hear from for a week or two ago, and finally he touched base with me and he said something incredible. Can you guys still hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
He said,
Yes.
Yes.
Kind of low. You're kind of low.
kind of low. Okay, let me just
Yes. Probably
put up
speak
my
up.
thing here, my volume. Is that better? Is that better?
I guess.
Can you hear me better now?
I don't really have much of a difference, but I could hear you pretty good
Too.
before.
It's not a much of difference, but could hear you.
So I can hear you guys very well. It's like my speaker's about to explode. I can hear you so well. What's going on? What do I need to do with my, do I need to do something with my sound on this bloody Zoom? Anybody knows anything about Zoom?
I don't think there's anything you can do right now.
It's just,
Right.
it's,
I think the sound is pretty good. Maybe some persons need to change their volume, but it's pretty clear.
okay. Doggone it. Thank you for that, Jensen. I was about to scream my head off trying to get louder. All right. So yeah. So he calls me and he says, you haven't heard from me because I had the flu. Can you imagine my surprise? I haven't heard anybody say they had the flu since the pandemic started. Have you? Remember the flu that we used to have every year? You take a flu shot, people have the flu, take some lemonade, and sleep for 2 days, and then they feel fine again. I've not heard anybody say they have had the flu. Have any of you had the flu? The old-fashioned
That
flu?
this is one of the only years that I've gone without having the flu. Thank God.
Okay, so that means every flu season, all we need to do is put on a mask, wash our hands, and stay 6 feet until the flu season is over? Is that it? Hmm,
Yeah.
Pretty
That's
much, that's how it's been spreading.
interesting. Okay, but then again, our bodies can fight the flu generally. We have antibodies to fight the flu. We don't need a vaccine. We just body fights it off. But this bloody COVID thing. All right. So apparently we're not out of the woods yet. That's the point at the moment. So you guys continue to do what you need to do. Okay. Let's see who's with us today. Angela, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, fantastic, Angela. Up and kicking. Annie Curtis.
I'm here.
To go. Okay. Andrea. Ramsey.
Here. Sorry, I'm here.
Yes, Andrea. Fantastic. Dimitri. Wilkinson.
Good morning.
Good morning, Dimitri. Okay. Ivania.
I'm here.
Okay, Ivania. Jaffe. Simmons.
Hi, I'm here. Good morning.
Morning, Jaffe. You made it. Jensen.
Good morning. Yes, Jensen is here.
Morning, Jensen. Okay. The other Annie Hepburn.
Good morning.
Okay. Good morning. Maria is here, I believe.
I'm here.
Okay, great. Maria, were you here last week?
No, sir.
Oh, I almost marked you present for last week, thinking you were here.
Spirit, yes, sir. That's why.
Of course, you could have done the non-compliant thing and said, yes, I was here, which is the whole thing we're discussing with this governance and compliance and all that stuff. Okay. O'Shea. Where O'Shea is. All right. Omar. Neely.
I'm here. Good morning.
Good morning, Omar. Have you checked out the movie Dr. Zhivago yet with Omar Sharif?
No, I haven't, I didn't remember.
Yeah, you don't time for that crap yet. But when you do have time, okay?
Certainly, I'll do it today. I'll let you know.
Wonderful. Let me know what you've discovered from
Yes, sir.
from your namesake. I'm almost sure that may have been one of the reasons why you were named Omar, if you investigate it. Okay?
All right.
Ever since Dr. Zhivago came out, quite a few kids around the world were named Omar, just like Kobe and Shaq and other celebrities. Okay. Shari Belafonte, are you there? Okay. Shari's not here yet. Right. Chiquita, are you there? Okay. Simone.
Hi, good morning. I'm here.
Good morning, Simone. Wonderful. Okay, Sarana McKenzie. Sarana isn't here yet. Sheena, are you there?
Morning, I'm here.
Good morning. Regina. And last but not least, Yolanda. Okay. Yolanda's not there. Okay, great. So
Mr. Wilkinson, I didn't hear my name, but I'm present, Delisa.
I didn't say Delisa.
I didn't hear my name.
Okay, yes, Delisa.
Yes.
Thank you for saying that.
I didn't hear mine either. Regina?
Regina.
Yes.
Okay, Regina. Regina, does that mean you're joining us for the first time?
No,
You're kidding me. Let me go back on my.
I'm,
You were
I'm
here.
not kidding at all. I have not missed any classes.
Kiss my foot. Regina, do you have an alias?
Uh, I don't think so.
That's interesting. This is exactly why you should never presume or take anything for granted. Because I don't see your name on my list, Regina. How did that happen?
Wow.
Hmm.
I
But
don't know.
that is fascinating. Okay, but that can be resolved very easily because all I need to do is add Regina to my list. Okay, Regina, what's your last name, Regina?
Forbes,
Oh,
one of those colonial last names.
yeah. Aha. So you actually were aware of that.
Yes,
Yeah,
I,
absolutely. Remember, all of our original names sounded something like this. Gunga or something, originally. And then when they brought folks over,
I had a little fascination with.
say it again.
I didn't hear the question.
All I was saying, originally all of our names were essentially something like Kagunte or Kunta Kinte or something. And then somebody figured out like, wait, that's too complicated. We need to give these folks a more familiar and simple name, and so we'll give them, or they'll be able to adopt ours. And that's how we all got stuck with it. Fascinating, actually. I wonder how many history classes teach that part of the history. Not many.
Yeah.
I don't recall them teaching it when I was in history class. They just talked about the old English stuff, the colonialization by the English.
No, they still don't.
Still don't. My. That's interesting. And I wonder, okay, I know this is an AML class, but you know, makes you wonder, what's wrong with teaching it? What's wrong with saying it? What's wrong with folks knowing a little bit about the origins of something? All right, Ms. Forbes, yes, you have a colonial name, just like me and others. Um, Whenever people say you're Wilkinson, I said yes. And they have that look like certainly not a plantation name, is it? They don't say it, and I look back and I don't say certainly not. So it's a British name. So yeah, something to think about. Okay, Regina, thank you. You've been, welcome aboard. You've been here for 3 sessions, 2 sessions so far now today.
Yes, sir.
Hold on it. Okay, Regina, you sound sincere. I'm going to take your word for it. Clearly was an oversight on my side. I'm sorry about that. I I saw the photo come up and I'm thinking, okay, that must be somebody else. Knowing it was Regina. Okay, fantastic. So here we go. Does anybody remember essentially where we left off last time? By the way, are you guys getting ready for papers, examinations, whatever you have to do?
Yeah.
Yes, we're supposed to be discussing the next assignment this week as well.
Or is it this week?
Yes, sir.
Oh, darn it. Why was I thinking it was next week? Are you sure it's this week?
It should be
Yeah.
because the paper is due on the 4th.
Yes, it is.
The paper is due when?
on the 4th
July?
of July.
Fifth of July.
July
Okay, yeah.
5th, July 5th.
Wow. That's interesting. I think we
Right. I believe it was, oh, sorry. I was going to say, I believe it was scheduled for next week, but you agreed to move it up to this week's class because it was so close. If I remember correctly, I think you said we'd do the first 45 minutes of this class with it. I
I'm
believe it was scheduled for next week. I could be wrong.
no, you may be absolutely right. I think what I was waiting for was a copy of that paper from the Institute, and I didn't get it, and I didn't get back to them. Does anybody have a copy that you can email to me
Of what?
of the paper? Do you have an electronic copy? Anyone?
You mean of the question paper?
Yes.
I could screenshot it and WhatsApp it to you.
Oh, darn it. The old part, the other way. How many?
I don't know how to upload it on the Zoom thing, so
Uh,
sorry.
can you screenshot it and then email it to yourself and then email it to me?
Give me an email quickly. I wrote it down the other day, but I give me quickly again, please.
How to do that?
No, give me your email address quickly,
Oh, my
please.
email. Yeah, sure. S as in Samuel.
Uh-huh.
J as in Jack.
Uh-huh.
H as in Henry. Wilkinson. WILKINSON
Uh-huh.
at hotmail.com.
Okay, I'll send it now.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. So yeah, what I'll do is we'll finish up the MLRO thing first, and then after that I'll take some time and talk about the paper itself. That'll give me enough time to get here for me to download it and all that stuff. And then the rest of the time we have today, we'll jump into Unit 13, which talks about the management of AML CFT policy, and we continue our trek towards how to be compliant and how to do this job more effectively, so to speak. All right, so I think last time we had started our discussions on the money laundering reporting officer and all the responsibilities that that person has, that job is mandated by law, that it's separate from compliance, and that even though it's separate, sometimes we can combine the jobs in certain organizations depending on time and circumstance, but certainly that job is generally supposed to be held independently of any other jobs so that these persons can be more effective at doing their work. Does anybody remember who the MLRO is? Who's the MLRO? Anybody? Who is the MLRO?
The money laundering reporting officer.
Yeah, and basically from what we gather so far, generally what are they supposed to be doing?
Well, she is actually, or he is the go-to person, the person that any suspicious activity, well, is using a bank as an example, any suspicious activity the bank deems to be suspicious enough to move forward, it would be moved forward to that person.
Indeed.
Yes, and then she would then do any additional or request any additional documentation or whatever is necessary and decide whether it's legitimate enough to move to be forwarded to the FIU.
Indeed, indeed. Absolutely. And how does that information get to the MLRO in the first place?
You mean via what? You mean it's reported to her? I don't understand the question.
That's okay, because believe it or not, there are people who are still in practice who still get a little stuck on that question. Because whenever I say, how does it get to the MLO? They're like, get to the MLO? What do you mean?
Isn't it compiled? You mean if it's sent to her via email, if it's hand delivered? I mean, am I thinking too simple? Is that what you mean?
No, that's not too simple at all. It could be hand delivered, it could be email, but what prompts it? What is it in the organization that prompts this to get this? Who gets it to the MLRO, and why? See, remember, like you said, once the MLRO gets it, they process it and send it off to the FIU as a suspicious transaction report. But who gets it to the MLRO in the first place and why? Who's responsible for that?
Supervisory and management level of a firm.
I know, which is what a lot of people still think. The MLO might confer with the management. Might.
Anyone can refer the complainant.
Anyone. How come? How come
Because it
anyone?
said it is their duty
How do you
to
know it's their duty?
uh,
You're getting warm, you're on the right track. I'm just getting down to the nitty gritty. So when you go into the world with it, you have no doubt. How is it they have the authority? How is it that anybody in the financial institution can do this? There's a reason.
Well, anyone who has suspicion that some transaction activity is illegal, they're required by law to report it. And that would include persons at the lowest level, including the customer service representative, all the way up to the management level. Everyone is legally required to do so. And they also can do so confidentially. And so, yes, they have a right to report it through whatever channel without having to go through management.
Full stop. The reason why anyone can do it in the financial institution, as he said, because the law requires it. That anybody who has a suspicion are by law required to report it. Period. From the janitor up to the management. Interestingly enough, there's still some persons who are not aware of that, but that is indeed the case. Okay? So that's something to keep in mind. Anybody, if you're walking around, if you go to work on Monday morning and you work for a financial institution and you walk in and you see something suspicious, like looks like the manager slept there and you felt suspicious, like something's wrong, you have an obligation to report it to the MLRO. Now, once the MLRO gets that information, they'll investigate and see if it has any basis for reporting. If they determine somehow that there's no basis for reporting, like you just said, like if somebody got you mad, then they're not going to make a suspicious transaction report to the FIU. But if your suspicion is deemed to have some substance, then it will be reported. Does that mean that you should try to determine whether the MLRO will accept your suspicion or not? No. Once you feel it, you have to report it. How about that? If you feel suspicion, you don't have the authority to try and not feel it anymore. That's technically what the law says. Now, a lot of people see suspicious things and they decide, I ain't reporting that because I don't want nobody to know I see nothing in Bahamianese. That's not what the law requires. Once you have a suspicion, your job is to report it. It's not your job to decide whether the suspicion has enough substance and evidence and information to forward as an STR or suspicious transaction report to the FIU. That's the MLRO's job. Okay? Something to keep in mind if you work for any kind of financial institution. Okay?
Mr. Wilkinson.
Yes.
Oh, yeah, I was having some trouble with my mic earlier. I had to type in the chat, but I know from experience, the statutory requirement to disclose is found in the POCA, the Proceeds of Crime Act 2018, and they clearly outline like how it should be done and whom it should be done to. That's for reference. If
Thank
anybody
you.
wants to check it out.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Please, let's follow her lead. For those of us who might not be aware, go to POCA. If you're not sure what POCA is, she'll tell you in a minute. And what is POCA?
That's it's an act that was passed, Proceeds of Crime Act 2018, and it basically outlines what is considered a proceeds of crime, a criminal offense, and tipping off and disclosures to the FIU. and the role of the MLRO. It just outlines those particular areas. It's very crucial to the compliance area.
Yes, they are. All right, because that is your justification for the reporting of suspicious transactions. That is the MLRO's justification for assessing suspicious transactions, and that is the MLO's responsibility to report them to the FIU. If I am not mistaken, in the very near future, the FIU will soon have the ability to assess administrative penalties, among others, and so it will get to a point soon, like many other jurisdictions, that if it is discovered, for example, that something suspicious ought to have occurred and did not occur, there could be an assessment of one kind or another. But again, that's just an extension to the already existing law, okay, with regards to the reporting of suspicious transactions. Okay, so those of you who may not have been aware of that, please check out Poker 8 2018 if you are curious or need it, and go ahead and read that bit of material. You'll find that to be quite enlightening, especially if you work for a financial institution and you are an MLRO. All right. Oh, Ghana, this thing is real, unfortunately. Okay, so we now have a pretty good idea, not only from an academic perspective, but also now from a legislative perspective, what the MLO's responsibilities are and what we're required to do in this bloody job. Back in the day, when I used to be an MLRO, it was always interesting receiving and assessing suspicious transactions. Some of them, quote unquote, had merit. Others, quote unquote, were questionable. But again, doesn't matter whether it has merit or questionable. That has nothing to do with somebody reporting it. If they feel suspicious, they feel it. Doesn't matter if there's no basis. The law doesn't make any provision as to you have to determine a basis before you report your suspicions. It does not require that. Okay, you feel it, that's it, report it. And then the MLRO will take it from there in terms of what actually moves on to the next level, which is the reporting to the FIU. All right. So
Hi,
now,
Mr. Wilkinson.
yes.
Yes, just to let you know that Annie would have emailed the question to you. She left a note in the chat. She's unable to speak. She's just listening in, but she just wants us to let you
Okay, thank you very much.
know she emailed the question.
Thank
That's
you so much.
Annie Heber.
Yeah, please tell
No
Annie.
problem.
Thank you very much. Send her a little note, and I'll certainly get into that in a little bit.
Yeah, I sent it as well. I sent you a note to say I sent it. I guess you didn't see it.
Oh no, yeah, I have this doggone big sheet in front of me. I can't see my chat at the moment. Okay, so there we go. We now have this working knowledge of the MLRO now and how important this job is. And so our discussion today will begin with what we call in our heading, the various aspects. If you notice on page, whatever page that is, 3.2, I think it's 479 in your text, the various aspects of the role of an effective, see, not just any old MLRO. Should we have any old MLRO in our organizations? Like any old MLRO. Should we have one of them? Anyone?
No, the MLRO should be a senior person and that's respected in the financial services sector.
Absolutely. There should be no such thing as any old MLRO. But some people have any old MLRO. When I say any old MLRO, that's just a Bahamianese term for having a person doing that job who's not really qualified or senior enough to do that job. And some companies have persons who are not qualified enough or senior enough. And make no mistake, because you have your designation, your ICA, that doesn't mean that you're ready to be an MLRO. That means that you're getting ready, because you need to have a certain level of seniority as well within the organization. You can be an assistant, a junior, an MLRO in waiting, and all that stuff. But in terms of who's actually responsible ultimately for this job, it shouldn't be Tom, any old Tom, Mary, and John, even though some organizations do have quite a few of them. Because sometimes MLROs are not appointed based on person's seniority and ability and qualifications necessarily, but oftentimes MLROs are appointed because anybody knows why, other than those things? Because
The company requires one.
the company expediency, that's what it's called, expediency. We need one and we need one now. What other reason? Other than the required reason?
The person may have the qualification to do
They
the
may have-
job.
Yeah, they may have the qualification, but not the seniority, but they still appoint them because, well, maybe if they have the qualification but not the seniority, then that person will not be an opposing force to management. Do you follow where I'm going with that? In other words, what I'm saying is MLRO's job sometimes requires being in opposition. Does anybody know what that word is anymore? Being in opposition? Because you know that we're being conditioned to go along with anything. Have you noticed that? Go along with it. And then you can't, like, well, in my opinion, well, keep your opinion. Wherever the herd is going, let's go. Otherwise, we will seek you out and isolate you. If you haven't seen that trend, you will. The question is, when you see it, what will you do? Will you go with the herd? Or will you say, wait a minute, those swine are going to jump in the water. I'm not going to drown myself. All right. So yeah, you might have the qualification, but if you don't have the seniority, the lawyer says you should not be appointed. Some people appoint MLROs because they can manage them better. And anytime you feel you can manage an MLRO, that's not a good thing because that takes away the independence of the MLRO. Just like the internal auditor, the MLRO has to have a certain amount of independence so they can do the job without feeling any commitment to anyone in the job. So that if something happens, they say, well, that's my friend or that's the boss. So I will not send this to the FIU because the person implicated in this works in here and I know them. That's my buddy. That's the buddy of a buddy whose buddy is my buddy or something, whatever the hell it is. So it kind of gets tricky sometimes. The point is, it's not just academic, unfortunately. All right, just something to think about. So let's then see what's the big deal with the MLRO in terms of being an effective MLRO. All right, as usual, I'm going to start from the top of my list and work my way down. And so that means since Alma is not with us, Angela, that means you're always on the top of my list. Are you still there?
Yes, I'm here.
Fantastic. Why don't you pick it up for us then, Angela? 3.2, the various.
I don't have my textbook in front of me right now. I have to get, yeah.
Okay, should I get a pinch hitter for you while you do all that?
Yes, please.
I'll come back.
Yes, come back.
Annie, since Angela's working on that, you have to pinch hit for her. Annie Curtis, are you there?
I'm here, Mr. Wilkinson.
Okay, Annie. So while Angela is digging for a text, why don't you pick up for her? We'll get back to Annie. 3.2.
Okay. Various aspects of the role of an effective MLRO. Even in those jurisdictions where the role of the MLRO is narrowly defined and does not explicitly extend to money laundering prevention, the role should have various facets. The main responsibilities of the role are to receive internal SARs and STRs, evaluate internal SARs, STRs with reference to available business information, assess available information from internal sources, example, customer files, and external sources, example, web-based information, law enforcement circulars, suspect list, newspaper reports. Make a determination on whether an internal SAR or STR has merit and should be reported to law enforcement. Make external reports to law enforcement as necessary, given reasons for the suspicion and relevant background information. Okay, file internal disclosures which are not reported to law enforcement for future analysis in the event that a further internal disclosure is made about the same customer at a later date. Act as the main point of contact with law enforcement, dealing with both formal and informal requests for additional information. Act autonomously, if necessary, without reference to or undue influence from management.
Annie, stick a pin. You may think you just read a few points, and you did. But let me tell you something. If every one of you stop and consider each of those points, you'll see that this is a very serious job in financial services. Some of you may not be aware of it because a lot of MLROs do not practice their jobs in their entirety, so to speak. They get a report, they make a quick assessment, everybody's busy. There's a doggone enough time to go through all these steps that we're talking about here. This looks okay to send. They file a suspicious transaction report with the FIU, and they breathe a sigh of relief, like, thank God, at least that one is gone. Okay? Be assured that that's not where it all starts or ends. If you notice on this list that she read, okay, the easy part is this: receiving the internal SARST. What does SAR mean, by the way? Anyone?
Is it a suspicious activity report?
It is. Is it the same as STR, or is it something else?
I think one applies to a particular activity, and one is dealing with a specific transaction.
Technically, yes, but we do use them interchangeably, but yes. Okay, great. So you receive it, then you look at the report that comes in and you make an evaluation. Now notice this evaluation is not based on your gut feelings only. Notice all the things you have to be thinking and looking at to do your evaluation, okay? With reference to available business and presumably other information. Also, you're checking other internal sources inside and the company, outside the company, and all this stuff in order to put together something of a case to see if this suspicion has any relevance. Notice also the third, fourth point, does this have any merit at all? Is this, like, the person reported it, but do I need to pursue this? Because ultimately that's the decision you're going to take. And remember, even if the MLRO does not report it to the FIU for some reason, because they don't think it has sufficient basis for suspicion, they're still required to maintain a file in any event, so that if that name comes up again, or that suspicion comes up again, there's a quote unquote internal database. This person again, same suspicion was reported 3 months ago. Maybe I didn't look at this close enough, and so on. All that is part of the MLR's work. In addition to that, they're responsible for interacting with law enforcement. The most immediate law enforcement entity is the FIU. That doesn't mean that they cannot approach the police if there's, in their opinion, that they feel there's a direct criminal matter. But normally, MLROs would report their suspicions first to the FIU, who will conduct an analysis of the suspicion and then make a disclosure to the police with recommendations. Okay? In any event, the MLRO is responsible. That's the person in the organization who will be in touch with law enforcement. That means that technically nobody else should be talking to law enforcement. Does that mean that the CEO can't talk to the police? No, it doesn't mean that. The CEO could talk to the police, but the CEO should not try to usurp the responsibility of the MLRO, because that has two problems. Information gets mixed up if they're not collaborating, and secondly, it might create something of a conflict of interest. And thirdly, it might seek to diminish the independence of the MLRO. Okay? So to avoid those things happening potentially, matters of relating to law enforcement, within the organization should just simply be reported to the MLRO, which is why it is also recommended that those organizations who can afford it should also have a deputy or assistant MLRO, so that if the MLRO is out for any reason, that there is a backup generator. How about that? Who will be there to deal with law enforcement. Furthermore, law enforcement doesn't like to deal with too many people on matters because things get all mixed up, because everybody oftentimes have a different story. Same file, different story. How about that? How could that happen? Well, simple. Remember in the old days, we used to make a long line. I don't know if you guys ever did that. And then the person next to you, tell the person next to you something. And by the time it gets to the end of the line, it's something completely different. Right? Kind of like that. Okay? So the MLR is the main point of contact for law enforcement. And look at the last point. They are expected to act autonomously, and if necessary, outside the reference of any undue influence from whom? Anyone? From whom?
Senior management.
The management. Who is the management in financial institutions? Who are they? What do we call
Would that be
them?
the board of directors?
The board of directors and senior
Senior
management.
management,
Who is senior management?
like the heads of the departments and the
Yeah,
key
like
functions, like the
like
compliance.
like the CEO. Remember him or her?
Mhm.
The CFO, the COO, and any other O in senior management, that gang. Now, if you notice my tone, I changed my tone for a reason. And the reason is this. If you are an MLRO, anybody in this room is an MLRO? Yet? Not yet. Well, welcome to the real world. Because one day when you become an MLRO, potentially, you will be confronted by certain senior management people depending on who you work for and what you're trying to do. And those things on this list that you're trying to carry out independently. See? Autonomously. Autonomously. And certain people will try to get you to be less autonomous. I have been threatened with job loss when I was an MLRO trying to do my job according to the law. I've been to the point of being fired because I refused to change my position on MLRO compliance issues. I have been refused salary increases, bonuses, all kinds of intimidating issues because I refuse to act less than autonomously in my job as a compliance officer and or MLRO, all of which I've done. The academic side of this is the easy side. If you think you guys having a problem now, like with all this work, rest assured, this is the easy side. When you get into your firms and become a CO or MLRO or both, depending who you work for, it's going to be a completely different program. Okay? I remember once as a compliance officer, we had an inspection by the no less than the Central Bank of the Bahamas came in to do their usual inspection. Of course, they had their findings, which some of you may be aware of. You have to respond to, like, why did this happen? When you're going to fix it? How soon will you fix this? Give it a date when it'll be fixed, and so on. So I'm setting about my compliance duties, responding to the central bank about why this happened and when we're going to fix it and how. And at some point in my work, my managing director came to me. He's a French Canadian guy. He came to me and said, Mr. Wilkinson, we cannot send some of these answers because they kind of don't fit. I'm like, Monsieur, I didn't say Monsieur, I'm just being facetious. I'm like, sir, it doesn't have to fit. This is what the central bank requires, and we have to give them what they require. Oh, Wilkinson, I see sometimes you're not aware that you work for me and not the central bank. That's what he told me. And the reason why he told me that garbage is because he wanted me to be less autonomous. Senior management. Sometimes they are the biggest culprits of all, unfortunately. Which is why the central bank has been coming down heavier on boards in recent years. Most firms around the world that have gone belly up and fined gazillions of dollars are because of board people and senior management people not doing their jobs properly. So if you think that last point is just there to fill the space, I can assure you it is not, right? So when your time comes and you come up against some stuff, like, oh my God, I need this job, I can't afford to be autonomous. Well, doesn't matter what you need. Unfortunately, if you have that job, the job requires you to be autonomous, among other things, and to do what the law requires. I have 3 children, maybe, but the law is not concerned about that. The law wants you to do what the law wants you to do. How about that? All right. So I just thought I'd throw that in. So one day, if any of you become any of these things and you are confronted, perhaps you will recall what you're required to do. Now, whether or not you will do that is entirely up to you. Okay. All right, Annie, keep going. You started it anyway. Keep going.
Okay, there are a variety of additional features of the role that are often overlooked, including responsibility for maintaining an internal register of both internal and externalized SARs, STRs. In certain jurisdictions, for example, the Isles of Man, the maintenance of such a registrar is a legal requirement.
See that? My. It's not legal in the Bahamas yet, but in Isle of Man, it is a legal requirement. And if you're curious about Isle of Man, you know what you can do. You don't have to go to the library anymore and open an encyclopedia and you just Google it. My. Keep going.
Maintaining the documentation of the MLRO evaluation and determination process in respect of SARs, STRs, and other investigations.
Why are we maintaining the documentation, anyone? Why are we keeping it? Make a guess.
Well, for one, we have record retention rules and then also for evidence too.
Absolutely. We have record retention requirements and we have evidence that we need to produce when the time comes. Remember, if you are in the world of compliance and anywhere else, but we're in compliance today, if you don't have it documented, it never happened. You ever heard that? Doesn't make sense not having documentation. We did it. Where's the proof? Well, if you don't have evidence, you never did it. Period. Doesn't matter how you cry about it. Nobody cares about what you say. They're interested only in what you can prove. Except in the case of Bill Cosby, of course. Anybody ever heard that case? Anybody knows who Bill Cosby is?
Yes.
Did you hear about Bill Cosby's case? Evidence? What did he do? What did they say he did?
Well, they say he drugged the women,
Which women? Many or one?
many of them.
He
But only a
drugged
few, but only a few really came forward and pressed charges.
Okay, and what evidence did they produce? Anyone? What evidence did they produce?
He say, she say, and a crusty box.
Sorry?
It was a lot of he said, she said, and I think they found a old crusty box of Quaaludes somewhere in his home.
What evidence did they produce that he put the whatever it is in her drink? Did they have like a witness or a camera where he actually put it there and she drank it and then fainted?
No, it was just the witness testimonies and, well, corroboration, I guess.
Well,
But-
nobody was in the room apparently when they were together. There were
Well,
just two people.
apparently, the corroboration was that the stories were similar, which I always find kind of fishy because people can practice a story and then just everyone regurgitate the same story.
Absolutely.
But their claim was that the stories were consistent, which proved that it was like, I guess how can I say this? Like, it was like a thing for him, like a MO. They kind of made it seem like this is how he did it, and everyone just kind of colluded with the same story.
Is that evidence?
Well, he's in jail, so it must have been evidence enough for the judge.
I guess the same evidence where the white girl back in the old days said the black guy touched her and he never did and they hung him.
Pretty much.
It's interesting how the world is satisfied with that. Fascinating. But of course, if it is one of your sons who had consensual sex with a girl, but because something happened and she said he raped her, what happens then? Where's the evidence there? It's your son now, not Tingham's son, yours. Wouldn't you want evidence for that?
Yes, but in his case, I guess it was more circumstantial. They
You don't-
coined it as circumstantial evidence.
Yeah, of course. Remember, you're not supposed to judge people and hang them on circumstantial evidence. We all know that. If you go and look at the rules of evidence, you'll find that circumstantial evidence is not evidence. Interestingly enough. So if somebody finds circumstantial evidence on your son, would you be happy with that?
Not at all.
Not at all. Absolutely. Okay. Which is one of the reasons why I have a 24-year-old son. I tell him, when you meet a girl now, son, make sure you have all the dots thing and things crossed, especially in that country we are in called Canada. And like any other developed country, these crazy things are happening. Be very careful, because if something goes wrong and she says you did something, you could end up in prison for something you didn't do. Just like Tingham and Tingham them. I'm not saying we don't have those people who do, but where the evidence is there, fine. But remember, you cannot put somebody in prison or burn them up in the electric chair unless you provide evidence that they committed murder. Even if you have a feeling is not enough. But these are all subtleties that will come into your job as you try to be autonomous as an MLRO or compliance officer. That's really the other point I'm making. And the issue of having documentation, the reason why you are required to keep the file is so that there doesn't have to be any collaboration by 5 people. Like, I'll bring in 5 people from the organization to prove I did it. Nobody's interested in that. Same thing. You have to have written documentation. That's the point. Otherwise, there will be no substance to your claim as an MLRO or CEO that you did it, because you can't prove it. No matter how many people you bring in to collaborate your story. Because you can always tell people to say stuff, as somebody said earlier. So when the regulator comes in, they'll listen to you for a minute. It don't take too long. But what they want to see is your evidence. You can't produce that, the hell with your collaboration. We all know that some people went into a room and said we'll all say the same bloody thing. And even if it's not collusion, it's still not evidence. Something to think about whenever you take on these kinds of jobs. Okay? But it also applies not only for the MLOCO, it applies in general, in case somebody accuses you in the future. And you screaming for evidence, they shut up. We don't need evidence. All we need is collaboration. And you know very well that you're innocent. But enough people get together, the same story, dog eat your lunch. Even here in the Commonwealth. All right. Annie, you started all this. Keep going.
The regular generation of management information on internal and external SAR, SDR, reporting trends and weaknesses. Cultivating an awareness of developing money laundering typologies. Remaining fully up to date with AML CFT legislation and guidance in relevant jurisdictions. Monitoring in conjunction with the function separately responsible for such procedures, usually compliance, the internal effectiveness of the AML CFT procedures. Being aware of countries that do not have adequate AML CFT frameworks in place. Being aware of the content of lists of suspects and sanctions issued by law enforcement and regulatory authorities. Contributing to the content of staff AML CFT training. Contributing to the maintenance of a sustained high level of staff AML CFT awareness between training sessions. Preparing for and dealing with regulatory visits and inspections. In Jersey, maintaining a list of all inquiries received from law enforcement agencies and records relating to internal and external disclosures. In Guernsey, under the 2010 handbook, maintaining regular contact with the board to ensure that the board is able to satisfy itself that all statutory obligations and provisions in the handbook are being met and that the financial services business is taking sufficiently robust measures to protect itself against the potential risks of being used for money laundering and terrorist financing. In Dubai, MLROs should report to the board at least annually, and copies of the report and the board's responses must be submitted to the regulator.
My. Keep going.
In Qatar, annual MLRO reports must be submitted to the board, although it expected that additional reports may be required by the board, and that reports should be submitted on the initiative of the MLRO in discharge of their responsibilities. The MLRO role carries with it significant responsibility. The MLRO will act in effect as the gatekeeper of information, the disclosure or non-disclosure of which can have potentially serious ramifications for both customers and organizations. The features of the role outlined above, if present, are indicators that the MLRO is discharging the function in a manner that is consistent with that responsibility.
Okay, stick a pin again, Annie, because you keep saying stuff. Notice the previous list in itself was long enough, and then there's more. And all of these things have to do with your organization's MLRO. Believe it or not, in case you were not aware of it, you're now aware of it. That's why I took the time for you to go through it, for us to go through it, what you might call line by line, because just to impose the importance of it on your will. Because a lot of MLROs are not doing all these things, understandably, for one reason or another, but the point is they're required to be doing these things. Okay? And then, of course, our textbook takes us on a little international journey to Jersey, where they have certain MLRO requirements, and then to Guernsey, where they have this thing in writing, hardcore, the reporting to the board, and making sure that everybody's tied up in this process. So nobody could say they did not know what was going on in the organization. And then Dubai, all the way on the other side of the world, took us way right out of the Western world, so that we can see that this thing is not unique to us in the Western world. this, I was about to say crap, this requirement or these requirements are worldwide, thanks to the OECD and company. Okay, Dubai even, very strict MLRO requirements. So strict that the work of the MLRO and their interaction with their boards must be submitted to the regulator, not maybe, or held until the regulator asks for it, God forbid. It is a requirement. It is an annual requirement. And even little Qatar, somewhere the hell, somewhere over there in the east, have their own little MLRO thing going on, reporting to the board, coming up with their own independent reports, sending stuff to the board that they discover for information and feedback. That means that this is very serious international business. The job of the MLRO is not to be taken lightly in the organization, is not to be given to any Tom, Dick, and Harry, Mary, Sue, and Jane, as you can, I hope, now see. All right. And then, just when we think we're done, we're not done with the MLRO. I sincerely hope that they're being paid a salary that is commensurate with this responsibility. All right, keep going, Annie. More
Okay.
MLRO stuff.
3.3, the key skills and attributes of an effective MLRO, MLCO. Having carefully considered the various aspects of the role of an effective MLRO, an organization should then identify the key skills and attributes that the MLRO should possess before appointing an employee to discharge that role. Key skills and attributes include an intimate knowledge and understanding of the organization's products and services, including their legitimate uses and their laundering vulnerabilities. An intimate knowledge and understanding of the organization's typical customer profile, including any vulnerabilities associated with such customers. Perceptiveness, the ability to recognize potentially suspicious activity. Analytical skills, the ability to absorb and analyze information, often under pressure. Research skills, being able to recognize what additional information may be required before definitive reporting decisions are made. Communication skills, the ability to communicate clearly and succinctly, both verbally and in writing to personnel at all levels. Approachability, members of an organization must feel that they are able to approach and discuss concerns with the MLRO. Confidence, both to make and to justify decisions. Decisiveness, to be able and willing to take ownership of the SAR's, STR's decision-making process. Skills tend to be processes or knowledge that can be learned. Example, product knowledge, whereas attributes tend to be innate to individuals and are difficult to teach. Example, confidence and decisiveness.
And ethics. Keep going.
First and foremost, the MLRO is a risk manager and as such must be capable of identifying, quantifying, and managing risk. The role requires a particular skill set and an organization should give careful consideration to these skills and attributes before appointing an employee to the position. Above all, the MLRO should have authority, independence, and in-depth expertise and be a great communicator.
Thank you very much, Anna. I think you caused enough disruption with the job of the MLRO this morning. If you had any doubts before about the significance of this job, some of you may have run into an MLRO or whatever the case might be, or have heard stories about the job. Now you do not have to wonder. You can see that it is not a fly-by-night job. It is a very crucial and critical job, both from the internal and external position of the firm. Okay? Notice words like intimate, analytical, research skills, communication skills, confidence, all these things that take a considerably long time to learn and acquire to do them properly, which means that while teeny boppers in the firm may have the academic skills to do some of this job and a lot of this job, chances are, unless they've had some time and experience, they're not going to be able to do the other side of this job, which is the non-academic side, and which is sometimes equally or more important. Okay? And this is why we often say that in choosing an MLRO CO, that we need not only have persons who are trained, qualified academically, but certainly of a senior enough. See, senior enough, been around a while, been in the trenches a while, fought some battles, did some real stuff, came out with some bumps and bruises. Then perhaps such a person could be considered. If they haven't been through that kind of stuff yet, you could go ahead and appoint them. You'll just have to deal with the bumps and bruises that you'll get along the way. And hopefully the appointed MLRO and the organization itself will survive the storm. Bad enough trying to survive a storm with all that seniority. Without it, you're taking a risk. And many organizations take that risk. Some are successful, some are not so successful. All right, any questions before we go on? Of course, you can raise a question anytime. Please feel free. All right, Dandria, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, Dandria, why don't you pick it up for us then? 331, where should commercial, that's interesting, pragmatism fit in? Right, that's interesting. What the hell is commercial? Anything have to do with this big time job of the MLRO? All right, let's see. 331.
Okay, where should commercial pragmatism fit? This attribute essentially goes hand in hand with business awareness, as mentioned above. Together, they have a material team and their level of respect, and therefore able to demonstrate a good understanding of the market and business in which they operate, so they can apply judgment in seeking the best way to achieve compliance for their firm. Failure to achieve this may result in the development of impractical solutions. It is also imperative that the AML CFT professionals appreciate and empathize with the commercial pressures faced by the business. While it is important to remain independent, AML CFT
Okay, where did Dandria go? Andrea, are you there? Can anybody else hear Dandria?
No, I can't hear her.
Yes, something is going on with Dandria's mic. Can somebody type in something and say, Andrea, we can't hear you. Something is going on with your mic, please?
Hello?
Andrea, is that you? Okay, sounds like Dandria is having mic transmission. Something is going on.
Oh, hello? Are you able to hear me now?
Dandria, is that you?
Yeah, I don't know what internet dipped. Sorry about that.
Okay, no, loud and clear. Can you just go back to the second paragraph then so we can?
Okay, it's AML CFT professionals from there?
Yes.
Okay. AML CFT professionals must be able to demonstrate a good understanding of the market and business in which they operate so they can apply judgment in seeking the best way to achieve compliance for their firm. Failure to achieve this may result in the development of impractical solutions. It is also imperative that the AML CFT professionals appreciate and empathize with the commercial pressures faced by the business. While it is important to remain independent, AML CFT professionals who are disengaged from the business or who simply quote from rule books will add little value to the organization as a whole. If they are seen to operate in isolation, they will often find themselves bypassed or consulted only at the very last minute. This means they have missed the opportunity to influence the outcome.
Wow.
There is a need for the AML CFT professionals to be pragmatic and balanced in their recommendations, enabling the firm to achieve regulatory compliance in a way that helps to achieve the firm's commercial and strategic objectives. Compliance officers must remember that compliance is not an end in itself. It is a means by which to achieve the positive outcomes for all key stakeholders, and from this, the continuing viability of the firm. Factors influencing the choice of the MLRO. The decision as to who is given the responsibility within a particular organization is usually influenced by the following factors, some of which are more relevant than others. The size of the organization, the nature of the organization, the scope of the role as defined by the legislation, the organization's products and services, the seriousness with which the organization regards its AML CFT obligations, the person's ability to operate at a senior level and have the respect of the firm's senior staff, as well as that of regulatory agencies. Whether an individual can be trusted not to under or over report. In the UK, there is a requirement that the MLRO should be senior and should be able to exercise his or her own authority. No doubt the reason that both sufficient seniority and authority are mentioned is that they are two factors that are directly relevant to the autonomy of a particular individual within an organization. Sufficient autonomy is a vital prerequisite for a competent and effective MLRO.
And before you go on, DeAndre, let me just say this. This seniority and autonomy thing, I've been saying for a while, I'm not saying that a 30-year-old cannot do this job well. Perhaps they can do certain aspects of it well. It's just that when you're 30, you just haven't seen a whole lot of things yet. You only think so. Which is why I've been trying to, whoever would listen, say to firms, don't get rid of your 50-year-old too soon. You might need them to be an MLRO who is required to do this job autonomously and independently, with who has had a whole lot of wars and who have learned how to stand up against even the harshest boards and senior management and regulators and others, and be fair at the same time. So don't dump them too soon. They would make excellent COs and MLROs and such things. That doesn't mean your young whippersnappers cannot be there getting groomed. And maybe they'll learn a few things if they're interested along the way. But it is something that I've had discussions with persons and organizations about, because you know, when you turn 50, they start trying to kick you out, so you're too old for this and that. All right? Perhaps you are too old to run the 100 meters, but you're certainly not too old to be an autonomous and effective and independent CO and MLRO and internal auditor and any such job that requires stability, sturdiness, independence, and somebody who can stand up against the storm. All right, keep going.
Okay, the case study is the need for an MLRO to be a senior employee. A is the MLRO of a bank branch in the Cayman Islands. A receives an internal SAR from B, a junior bank official, in relation to an account for a valued customer of the bank who has a net asset value of US 800 million, of which the US 200 million is held and managed by the bank. The basis of the SAR made by B is that 2 transfers of US 5 million were made from the account to a bank account an institution in a country with inadequate AML CFT provisions.
Red
B had
flag, sorry, red flag number one. It's being, all this money sent to an institution in a country with inadequate AML CFT provisions. And in order to know that, you have to be on top of your game, okay? Keep going.
B had asked C, the customer relationship manager responsible for the relationship with the customer, to explain the rationale for the transfers. C was unable to explain the reasons for the payments, but told B that the payments were legitimate. Not being satisfied with this explanation, B conducted some research and discovered that recent press reports had suggested that the jurisdiction to which the payments were made harbors terrorists. The basis of B's SAR to A was suspicion that the customer might be involved in the funding of illegal activity. A talks to C, who becomes both impatient and irritable. C has no explanation for the transfers, but says if we're going to ask questions every time we transfer money on behalf of customers to third parties, we may as well shut up shop. You could create real problems for yourself if you start sticking your nose into this customer's affairs. C is the local managing director of the bank, whereas A is an associate director. A fair for his job, but also fares for his career if he fails to do what he thinks is right. It is clear in this example that the managing director is able to exert significant pressure upon the MLRO not to make an external SAR to law enforcement. The harsh reality is that MLROs sometimes find themselves between a rock and a hard place in making decisions that can be very unpopular with colleagues. Having the autonomy to make such decisions in good faith without duress or undue commercial influence ordinarily requires the MLRO to have sufficient seniority.
Thank you very much, Deandra. I think you have ruffled enough feathers with what you have said so far. All I can say, if there are no compliance officers and money laundering reporting officers in this group yet, some of you will no doubt be at some point in the future. And even if you're not, you will be working for organizations where if you see a suspicious transaction, you're required to report it. And certainly you're required to have knowledge of some of these things so that you can be a better all-around employee. That's the whole point. So this information is going to be a benefit to you one way or the other. If you ultimately become a CEO, MLRO, or any such thing, it'll be even more beneficial to you. And it's just as well you know what some of the roadblocks and issues and responsibilities are now. And in the last hour or so, we have seen a whole host of these kinds of things, which makes this job so very intriguing and challenging. Please take note of this case. This case is only a simple example of many other situations where senior management and management people and supervisors and others exert pressure on employees in doing certain jobs to get them to not, it's okay to report on this, but not on that. It's fine to do this and not on that. And try not to give a response and try to intimidate persons who are trying to do their jobs by saying, you know, why do you need to know the reason? You're cutting off business. That when I go into my next meeting with management, I'm going to report to you that you are stifling commercial activity in this doggone this company. And everybody needs to know that you're the one, you, the MLRO CEO, are causing us not to have business because you are questioning everything that we do in trying to generate business for this bloody company. Do you get it, Mr. Jones, Ms. Smith? Kind of thing. And you have to know how you're going to deal with that, okay? Because sometimes you might walk into a meeting with senior management, nobody talks to you because that's their way of ostracizing you for not joining in the group and doing what they say. Okay, for sure. Jensen, are you married?
Not married. Well,
Not yet. Well,
not as yet.
okay. Let me give you an example of how pressure is put on. So when you get married, you'll know how pressure is put on MLROs and CEOs. When you get married one day and your wife wants to do something like she wants to, let's say, let's go on a trip. Or let's go to Fort Lauderdale for the weekend. You're like, we can't afford it. And she's like, if we wait to afford it, Jensen, we'll never go. And you're like, I know, but we just can't afford it right now. There are other responsible. We'll pay them later. And you're like, We have to deal with our responsibilities first. And she said, well, I want to go to Fort Lauderdale, Jensen. I haven't traveled in a while. I feel cooped up in this house with you. See, she started internalizing it. And all of that now is to get you to do what, Jensen?
To go on that trip.
Yes, but you know very well that you guys need to pay those important bills, don't you?
Agreed.
And she says,
Agreed.
okay, then you don't love me anymore, Jensen, because you wouldn't even take me so I could catch myself. You just have me around here with you all the time. See, notice the pressure is ramping up. And now you're starting to feel, my God, where's my mommy? Because you're like, my God, what is this I'm in? And then she said, and then you're like, I know, honey, but we can't do it now. And then she stops talking to you, give you the silent treatment. You know what that is, Jensen?
That's, well, pressure, adding fire to the flame.
If you think you know what the silent treatment is, in theory, wait until you get married and your beloved wife gives you the silent treatment. Because all that is designed to do what? Same as senior management. What is it designed to do, Jensen?
Gets you to comply or do what they want to, in essence.
But if you are an astute MLRO CEO, what would you do? Despite all that silent treatment and quiet attitude and indifference, what should you do, Jensen?
When you go on a whole firm and do what needs to be done.
Hold firm. Absolutely. Yeah. Hold firm, especially if it's important. Now, you know, if you have the money, you just don't want to spend it, that's different. But if it's important, hold firm. That's the point I'm making. That's another case study for you when you get married. But it's the same principle. And then she started ramping it up even more. Now she's not talking to you. She's acting funny and all that stuff. She gets up in the morning, no good morning. And then when you come home, like, what's for dinner, sweetie? No dinner. And you're like, kiss my foot. What the hell? Should I give in? Should you give in, Jensen?
Well, that sounds like a losing battle. So you shouldn't, but in that scenario, very likely you're going to. Maybe not as a compliance officer, but in that scenario,
yeah, I know.
9 times out of 10.
I know.
At that stage, you might.
I know. And you're not to be faulted for taking that position at that point. However, the requirement is that you shouldn't still. You should just open a can of spaghetti, eat it, and go to sleep. Because you know how important it is. See my point?
Agreed.
Same thing with the firm. Same thing with the firm. They're going to get to a point where they're going to cause you to break if you're not careful. And then you will violate the law even, wouldn't you? By not doing the job as required. See my point? It's an interesting situation, the correlation. And if you think it stops, so now you figured, okay, I'll go to mommy and eat, or I'll open a can of spaghetti, doggone it, but we're not spending this money, we need to pay these bills. And she's like, okay. So when nighttime comes, Jensen, and you try to snuggle, Jensen, and you try to be like, oh, that loving husband, and she turns her back to you and say, you don't want to do what I say, then I'm not doing anything intimate with you, Jensen. I'm not being intimate. I'm not cooking. I'm not nothing. What do you do then?
Might end up on the couch and all.
Okay, you're on the couch. What do you do then? Should you give in?
No, you should do what needs to be done because it's in the best interest of the family. And maybe they'll see the wisdom in that later on.
Case closed, whether they see the wisdom or not. You have to do what's in the best interest of the family, including her, whether she sees it then or not. Same thing on the job. You have to do what is in the best interest of the firm, whether they agree or not. And that's why you cannot have any Tom, Dick, and Harry doing this job. That's why many organizations don't hire persons who are senior enough, strong enough, experienced enough, that as soon as no food is cooked, they give in. I'm not giving any salary increases here, Mr. Johnson, or whatever pressure they bring to bear. Everybody stops talking to you, looking at you funny, and even threaten your job. And some people are actually going to be fired. We no longer require your services. So now you're home for trying to do the right thing. All of these are pressure points designed to get you to. So we're back to autonomous again. My. Okay. Elisa, are you there? Sorry, has Dimitri read yet? Dimitri, are you there?
I'm here.
Okay, Dimitri, why don't you pick it up? Common MLO problems. Okay. I guess it would follow that have problems after all that. What are the common MLO problems?
Right. 3.5 common MLRO problems. Common MLRO problems difficulties can include a lack of authority, intimidation by more senior members of an organization, lack of adequate resources, including a lack of time, an inadequate level of awareness among staff of money laundering risks and obligations, the challenge of dealing with internal staff as well as customers when a suspicious transaction report has been made and consent to proceed is delayed, and poor record keeping.
My, keep going.
All these problems are normally indicative of deeper rooted issues within the organizations, characterized by an inadequate culture of compliance. In Unit 14, we will examine how the MLRO can positively influence the compliance culture of an organization. In the following example, sorry?
Keep going.
Okay, in the following example, the bank turned a blind eye to all of the red flags and ignored the warnings of the MLRO. Example, Wachovia Bank. In March 2010, Wachovia Bank, now owned by Wells Fargo, settled the biggest action to that date brought under the U.S. Bank Secrecy Act. It paid federal authorities $110 million in forfeiture for allowing transactions later proved to be connected to drug smuggling, and incurred $50 million fine for failing to monitor cash used to ship 22 tons of cocaine.
I'll stick a pin one moment for me. Let me just point something out in this other case, Dimitri. If you guys are not familiar with Wachovia and Wells Fargo and all that, you can always look it up. Not too long ago, Wells Fargo was also involved in some scandalous issue where they were fined in recent years another gazillions of dollars. The reason why we said back in 2010, $110 million was the largest fines, because nowadays in the last 5 years, we've had double and triple that amount being fined, being fines imposed on financial institutions for these same kinds and other kinds of AML CFT violations. In some cases, the money went into the billions, believe it or not, for these kinds of violations. And notice, this fine was paid for allowing transactions, see, later proved, not presumed. They cannot bring a fine or a case against the organization without on presumption alone. It had to be proven that these transactions were connected to drug smuggling. That is always easier said than done. Okay, proven. That's the bottom line, and which is one of the reasons why a lot of money laundering and other cases continue to go on and go unresolved, because it's not easy to always prove what's happening. Okay, keep going.
Okay, I continue. One of the most shocking details of the case was the fact that Wachovia's London-based MLRO, a former policeman, Martin Woods, had flagged the transactions as early as 2006, when he was scolded by management for submitting suspicious transaction reports. Instead of being praised, the bank bullied Woods, for which he later won a settlement from the bank in 2009. He was vindicated by a letter from the controller of the currency in Washington, who stated that Woods had demonstrated great personal courage and integrity by speaking up.
Now, folks, again, sorry, I just have to say these things while the fire is hot. Please take note of that paragraph. See, Do not take it lightly. I know you're in your academic life trying to get through this thing, and that's fine. But sooner or later, whether you're an MLO or COO or not, you're going to be confronted with some of these things, maybe of a different kind, but the context may be the same or similar. And the question will be, are you going to be as bold as this MLRO? Notice the words. The management bullied. This is not uncommon. Many organizations, not only financial institutions, churches, charities, wherever people are doing stuff, whenever you don't conform to the status quo, they get together somehow and bully you. They have all kinds of creative ways to make your life miserable. Even in church, in God's house, I'm saying, where you start asking questions about certain things, they stop talking to you. In church, when you go to prayer meeting, nobody communicates with you anymore. They ignore you. They do all kinds of weird stuff. When you go to praise God on Sunday, they act funny towards you. In church, all because you raise a certain question about what did the bishop do with the money? When are we going to get the financial report for this church? Why is it that he keeps staying late with Sister Antoine? And so on. You start getting into that compliance stuff, man, they're going to bully you, just like they did Mr. Woods. And so one of the reasons why people try not to get out of the good graces of the bullies, because they don't want to deal with the consequences. Thank God for people like Mr. Woods, who stood his ground and was eventually vindicated. Problem is, some people have to go through hell and high water before vindication comes. And that is the question that we all must answer. When our time comes, what will we do? Whether you have an ICA degree, certification or not, what will we do? All right, keep going, Dimitri.
Okay, I continue. Some of the most harmful problems encountered by MLROs emanate from the territorial mindset of customer relationship managers, or CRMs, or directors, whose role it is to generate and retain valuable customer relationships. In the Wachovia case, the Miami police was loath to upset customers who generated huge sums of money despite the obvious risks involved. In circumstances where SARS or SARs about such customers are made by other members of staff, the overenthusiasm some CRMs to service customer needs can lead to a range of difficulties for the MLRO, including obstruction in the sharing of customer due diligence and business information needed by the MLRO to properly evaluate internal SARs, appeals to management by CRMs for the MLRO not to be allowed to probe into customer affairs, a feeling of defensiveness resulting from a relation by the CRM that they too should have been formulated a suspicion about the customer. Such problems cannot be addressed by the MLRO alone. Management action is required to ensure that the MLROs are entitled to free and unobstructed access to CDD and business information. It is also the responsibility of management to protect the MLROs' right to ask any and all questions that may be necessary in order to properly evaluate internal SARs, STRs. MLROs who do not benefit from adequate management support will find themselves in very difficult and compromising circumstances. It is permissible for the MLROs to evaluate SARs in discussion with colleagues, both at the stage when they obtain the further information required before decisions can be taken and during final evaluation process. Very often, colleagues will be able to add value to this process. Care must be taken, however, to ensure the collegiality among management and the MLRO cannot be misconstrued as reticence on the part of management to delegate the necessary authority to the MLRO to evaluate these SAR, STRs without interference or influence. When decisions are made, it is particularly important that the considerations involved are well documented for future reference.
Thank you very much, Dimitri. I think we have made the position of the MLO clear in one form or another. There is no doubt about the major duties and responsibilities that they have to bear, that they should not be teeny boppers in the organization. They should be experienced, hardcore persons who have done some battles, who know the organization, who know how to stand up against bullying, and who cannot be easily intimidated. If you do not have such a person doing those jobs, those MLRO jobs and CO jobs, I'm not saying the job will not be done. The question will be, to what extent can we rely on the fact that the job will be done substantially and to the full effectiveness that the organization requires? Okay? That is the question. All right, so does anybody have any feedback you want to add to all that heavy hitting this morning? The interesting thing about everything we've discussed so far is that, yeah, we're talking about the CO and MLRO, but a lot of these principles and practices and bullying and all this stuff doesn't only apply to those jobs. People are bullied in other jobs as well. For example, in the financial accounting side of the organization, if you're a certain kind of financial controller or CFO and the board and the CEO want you to do something contrary to your generally accepted accounting principles and your own ethical standards, you can be bullied as well and even lose that job. So, man, we don't need your services anymore. And say, what's wrong? Am I not doing the job? Says, you're doing the job. We just don't need your services anymore, Mr. Jones. Now, here's your envelope with your pay package and whatever. Feel free to get out. They may not always say it that way. There are different versions of that. But that's the end result potentially. So this thing does not only apply to the MLROCO. The principles apply to any of us, especially those of us with senior and even middle management responsibilities sometimes, supervisory responsibilities. And we all have to beg the same kinds of questions, maybe in another form, but the context is the same. Okay, and so I say, a word to the wise is sufficient. Right? All right, so here's what we're gonna do. If there are no questions at the moment, I'm going to take a 5-minute break. You guys go stretch, have a cup of coffee, come back in 5 minutes. I'll give me a chance to download that information that was sent to me by Annie, set that up so we can look at the question for a little bit before we get into Unit 13. Everybody get that?
Okay. Okay.
All right, so see you guys in 5 minutes. 5 minutos, por favor.
And you need more money, go try. And I need that bucket. They have.
Get outside. They outside, right to the door. Second door.
But it has to be here somewhere. Let's just go once. I mean, you couldn't be that.
Sonia, you unmuted.
Okay, welcome back. Is everybody there?
Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. I hope you have a copy of your question in front of you. At least we can make reference. I'm assuming that everybody has done a question for the ICA already. Is that correct? Okay. I heard a little faint yes from somebody. I'll take that as a yes. So I don't have to remind you too much about certain requirements. I think for the most part, we already know that you're given a set of rules in submitting your assignment. But again, like customer relationship managers who want to onboard customers, they sometimes don't worry about all the rules because they just want the business first. And so sometimes they ignore, overlook, or violate the rules. And so I'm going to ask you to take some of that stuff you learned this morning and apply it to your assignment 2, if you didn't do it as diligently in assignment 1. And the first thing I will say to you in discussing your paper that is very crucial is do not avoid, overlook, or ignore any of the rules that are given. I cannot express that enough. Sometimes students assume that they're doing everything they should, and sometimes they're not. Sometimes students decide to take a shortcut because they started late, and therefore they violate or overlook some of the requirements by taking a shortcut, not having enough time, and all this stuff. Try not to find yourself in these fundamental problem areas, okay? Which is why I hope that everybody's already working on their paper. If you are just starting, dog eat your lunch. I'm not saying it's not possible to do a great paper. It is, if you work at it from today until July the 4th, every day. But the idea is, the reason why the paper is assigned, I presume, significantly in advance, is so that you don't find yourself doing last minute stuff. Last minute stuff is a violation as well, whether you know it or not. And it's a bloody nightmare. Okay? But there's still students who like this last minute thing, this adrenaline rush. And then while the adrenaline is rushing, we come up with a million excuses: work, overtime, children, spouse, church, pandemic, family, more family, additional family issues, and so on. And I'm not saying these are not all true, but it's certainly one of the reasons why you shouldn't wait until the last minute, because crap happens, okay? So that's the first thing I'm going to say, even before I even get into anything about the paper or any concerns you might have. Okay? They give you the rules, please follow the rules, see, from 1 to 6. I'm going to assume that everybody has that and will do that for assignment 2. But in case we have some perpetrators, because we always have a couple of people who are doing their own thing, part of it, some of it, portion of it, or whatever the case might be, please, 1 through 6, they didn't put that there by accident. If you didn't do it well enough in your first paper, please do it better this time. Notice, I'm saying all this stuff even before you get into the paper itself. It's like teaching your children how to brush their teeth long before they get to grade school. Because brushing their teeth is another life issue they need to know, no matter how they do in grade school. It's the same thing. So before you get into you must make sure that you are going to do these 6 things right at the top. Don't take any shortcuts. What else are they saying of interest before we go any further? Ensure that your work is properly referenced. Does everybody understand what properly referenced means?
Yes.
Okay. Because if you only half understand it or think you understand it and you send it in halfway, you could lose credit. That's exactly why they put it there. Some people think properly referenced means they just need to say something about it or send a little note that, oh, this came from the Bible or whatever. That's not enough. Properly referenced means you have to understand how to reference. And if you're not sure how to reference, find out how to reference, because you may have lost points in the last paper because of poor referencing. That's interesting. Okay. Look at number 6. Penalties will be applied for those students who submit their assignment after the due date. So yes, something blew up. You can submit it after the due date, but you will lose valuable points if you do that. It's not enough to say, thank God I can submit it after this due date. Fine. If you have an exigency, like something really, really, really terrible happened, and you have to do that, fine. But try to avoid that at all costs, because the points you lose for late submission are points that you need to pass your exam and to be more successful in your passing rate. Okay? For sure. Do not ignore the word count, even by 1 word. Now you might say, oh, Mr. Wilkinson, how the hell could 1 word make a difference? Probably not a lot of difference. The point is, you want to be seen as adhering to the rules. Just like with the pandemic. Remember when we couldn't leave the yard? You can come out in the yard to exercise, but you cannot leave your yard. If you step in the street in front of your yard, you are in violation. And technically, you can be cited. How about that? Same principle. And once you're cited, you could say, well, I was just in front of the gate. And then the law will say, we told you do not leave the gate, Mr. or Miss. And then you can argue with them. And they said, well, you're still going to be cited. It's just the same thing with these people. I hate, they'll still be cited. It's the same principle, okay? I notice all they have to say about word count, a whole big old 1, 2, 3 little paragraphs. I wonder why all that. Put in one sentence because they're trying to impress on students, because many students still violate the word count rule for some reason. Or some students send in like, I'll send in 3,000 and they won't notice. Well, they will notice because they're looking for it. They are doing compliance work too. They will count those bloody words, and if you're over, they will take off points that you need. And why lose valuable points for poor referencing? Violating the word count, things that you can control. Leave that to stuff you can't control in terms of not putting all the information in your answers that they're looking for. Don't lose points to stuff you can control. Can you guys still hear me?
Yes.
Okie dokie. All right. Moving right along. Just thought I'd throw them in. Plagiarism. Oh man. I hope none of you guys are trying to plagiarize. I'm assuming you know what plagiarism is by now. If you're still not sure, double check it. What the heck? When you Google it this time, instead of saying what is plagiarism, say what the hell is plagiarism? I don't know if Google will answer. And then if they don't answer, just put in what is plagiarism. Just to be sure that you're not doing it inadvertently. Some students plagiarize deliberately, thinking they'd get away, thinking the examiners have so many papers to mark. How they in the world they're going to know when I'm plagiarizing? They're going to check everything in my paper to see if I'm plagiarizing something? Well, don't presume anything. Because right off the top, if you violate any of those 3 sets of things I mentioned earlier, you can lose valuable points towards passing your paper alone. And you haven't even gotten into grading the paper yet. How about that? Students, that's all I can say. So those of you who may not have gotten through your first assignment well, or gotten the grade that you felt you should have gotten, bear in mind, it could have been because of any of these kinds of violations. I hope not, but it's possible. So when you're doing this paper now, make sure that those things are covered completely. Why the heck should you lose points just because of those things that you can control? Okay. All right. So at this point in the paper then, let me ask you guys, does anybody have any specific questions or concerns following what I've just said about paper assignment 2? Let it rip. I don't care what it is. What kinds of stuff you saw in paper 1 that concerned you, maybe going into paper 2? Or you basically are now professional paper persons like the devil is, I don't see too many issues. I got this. It's okay if you feel that way, nothing wrong with that. Remember, don't let me bully you into saying something you don't need to say. However, if you do have a question, see that word bully again? Bully. It occurs all over the place in case you didn't know.
Hi, Mr. Wilkinson.
Yes.
I'm not sure if you'll be able to speak to this, but I guess I was just a bit curious in terms of how the marking is done. You know, like there's that 30-point difference between a distinction and a merit. And I'm asking because like when you get the feedback, at least so far, where we only would have done one paper, like over overall marks were, overall feedback was good. But I guess there wasn't much explanation in the way of what could have led to points being lost. Like, I wonder if I'm making sense. Like,
Yeah, you are making sense.
given the feedback that I've gotten,
Yes.
it didn't appear as though there was anything substantial missing from my paper that
Right.
would have led to me getting like or losing points in certain areas. So I was just trying to figure out, well, what, where do you lose points then if there doesn't seem to be a lot of need for improvement?
Yeah, no, I understand what you're saying completely. I understand what you're saying completely. I have been a lecturer in all kinds of subjects for about 30 years, believe it or not. From way back in the day when University of the Bahamas was only the College of the Bahamas. From back in the day when Sojourner Douglas was still in the Bahamas. From back in the day when the St. John's University was on the St. Augustine's campus. From back in the day when Success Training College was a success, and so on. So from back in the day when Nova Southwest University was in the Bahamas, starting that campus operations at St. Andrew's campus, Bahamas Baptist College, who's still there. So I've been around for a little while, I believe. And I say all of that only to say this to your question. That is the standing question for students all the time, especially if you're doing overseas examination. If you're doing a local course and you're given a grade, you have a little leeway in terms of trying to get your lecturer to, or the institution to, quote unquote, justify the grade you got.
Right.
Most of the time we can do that. We can say, for example, and your question is very valid, actually, very, very valid. There's nothing flighty about that question at all. It's a very serious question. If you're doing a local thing, and your lecturer might be kind enough, or the institution might be kind enough to say, okay, this is the grading scale, since you're very adamant for some reason. You can press the local person, institution, and sometimes they might say to you, this is the grading scale, and these are the responses we expected to get, and these are the grades that are allocated for those responses. And because you didn't say this, or this that we were looking for, you said something, oh, you're not looking for that. And then sometimes you can even argue it every now and then. See? And so, okay, fine, I'll make an adjustment for that one, but the rest are not for that. And then you come to some kind of understanding. Okay, we can do that in a local setting sometimes. Unfortunately, in the international arena, when examinations are external, we do not have that luxury. Okay? So I'm going to suggest one or two things in the hope, perhaps, that it might add to making that better in your next paper, but there's no guarantee, unfortunately. Remember, your paper is being graded by, in the Bahamas, we say Tingham and, am I the only person knows about Tingham?
I don't.
Mike, you guys are still so young, babes in swaddling clothes. In the Bahamas, we have an expression that Tingham and Tingham them. That means all and sundry persons are grading your papers overseas. And each one of them is a professional, I presume, who has experience, like they have experience MLRO and CO, in grading these papers. And so we have to make the presumption. We can't collaborate anything like Bill Cosby. We have to make the presumption now that they, see, it gets tricky once it gets closer home, that they are applying their marking rules appropriately to the answers that you're given. You get my point? The only problem is we don't have the luxury, when I say we, I mean international students, don't have the luxury of questioning them and saying, why did I lose points for those? We don't have that luxury, unfortunately. All we can do is take the comments that they make and see somehow if we can do a little bit more. And in some cases, like maybe in your case, like God, but how much more? That is a gray area.
Right.
Unfortunately, yeah, it is a gray area. And international examinations have always been that way. Not only for the ICA, if you're writing your CPA, same thing. If they told you your passing grade is, or you failed, you're like, where? You can't ask anybody where. They're like, you failed, sister. Do it again. They don't use those words, but that's what it means. And you cannot go back to get any information on what area did I fail in. They might suggest some things like, oh, in the area of accounting, you did this. In the area of auditing, you could have said more of that, some of that. In the area of the governance, you could have said some, or whatever the case might be. But they don't really get into like the details and allow you to like WhatsApp them and say, can we have a discussion on how these grades are allocated? Unfortunately. So that is a very good question. And so all I can say to that is, when you approach a second question, approach it with the same due diligence as you did the first one. And of course, any comments that they made in your paper that they gave to say blah, 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 look at them carefully again to see if there may have been something you may have overlooked. Okay? Even if it's something as simple as grammar, to see they take off points for that stuff. And then they start adding up. And sometimes it may be the difference between potentially. So make sure your grammar this time is as good as it was the last time, God forbid, or better. Okay? Make sure your sentence structure is as good or better, that paragraphs and sentences are not rambling and become incoherent in the middle of some discussion or whatever. See my point? Things like that. They look at crazy stuff like that. Okay, make sure your paragraphs flow well and consistently one into the other. Don't start a discussion about one bright day in the middle of the night. See, then like, how the hell do you get to the night? So make sure that your thought patterns in your paragraphs are all flowing, that the information is flowing, that it's, it's reading smoothly, not all jumbled up, which some students tend to do. They give a lot of information is correct, but the information doesn't flow coherently. The grammar is not well put together. Okay, but not well put together. The spelling, oh my God, did they spell check this? Did they have somebody else look for errors, edit? They look at little things like that. And the problem is little things like that, they start taking up 2 here, 3 there, 5 there. Man, they don't tell you how much they take off for this, because that's not something that they predetermined to tell you. But in the grading, depending on who's grading, see? And we don't know if they have like a standard thing, like if we take off a point after 5 errors, we take off a point after 3 spelling. We don't know what it is, and we can't question it. That's the problem. Like, please, can I WhatsApp you? Like, we can question the local person like myself. So Wilkinson, why the hell did I lose 5 points? And I might be generous and say, well, you lost 5 points because, see, but we don't have that luxury with international examinations, unfortunately. So all I can say is whatever diligence you exercise in doing your first one, double up on that if it's possible. Make sure all of your T's are crossed and your I's are dotted. Make sure all your spelling is correct, your grammar is as well as you can do it. Because remember, sometimes we present grammar that we think is okay to us. But when it gets to an examiner, they're like, what the hell? And stuff like that, like, what? But to us, we figure it's okay. And I've seen that as a lecturer locally, students, right, especially in the heat of a paper and examination, whatever, man, they think that they have it together. And then when it gets to the exam, you start reading it like, so why did they wander off into the wilderness with that thought? And didn't they have somebody edit this paper to see whether or not the grammatical structure and so on? And again, the big question is, well, what the hell are we worrying about all those details? Why don't they just focus on the big thing, the question? Didn't I give all that information about this case study and that case study and doggone the regulatory requirements and the jurisdictional issues? Didn't I give all that? Yes, you did. And they'll tell you, most students that present information are very knowledgeable, and they present a lot of knowledge information. But sometimes whether you get that final great grade or just the next one or just a passing grade, is oftentimes the difference between the little semantics. Okay, so be careful. That's all you can do in these kinds of cases where you're doing external examinations. Okay? They give you some feedback, but they don't come back and say why you didn't get this or that. And here's what we were looking for, and that's why you didn't get the grade, unfortunately. Thank you very much for that question, because I think the answer to that I just gave hopefully will be helpful to everyone who's doing this paper. Okay, absolutely. I noticed also that this paper, thank you very much for that question. That was a very good, balanced, current question that sometimes for some reason students don't want to ask. They don't get into that. And then others like get bold enough like yourself. Like you ask autonomy, like why don't they? Way to go. All right.
Mr. Wilkinson, it
Yes.
appears as if this course it's very, they seem to discount very heavily, because in my review there were only 2 questions out of what, the 6 or 7. They said I could have added like one item, like how a firm would be affected. I could have added reputation.
Yeah.
And then another question as it relates to money laundering. They said I could have added, these are 2 little one-liners, and you know, while I passed, yes, and I did well, I realized that this course is very easy to fail.
Yeah,
because and they discount very heavily for a small thing. A small thing. You could have answered the question 95% accurately or in an excellent way, and they will make that 5%. 50% just to, it seems to take away from it. I don't,
I know.
It's very,
That's always been the hue and cry. If it's any you're absolutely right. And when I say you're absolutely right, I'm speaking now as a student, not as an examiner or lecturer. Okay, because you may or may not know that I also grade papers for STEP International. You guys ever heard about STEP?
Yes.
Huh? Well, you have all kinds of things to Google now. I grade for STEP International out of the UK. And papers are presented every year for those persons who want to become STEP members through the essay route. So they have to do a big time paper from anywhere from 30 to 50 to 60 pages with response to certain predetermined questions. And so I see papers coming in from all jurisdictions around the world, including many of those that we saw in our case studies, Qatar and Dubai and Caribbean and UK and Asia, and all over. The papers come from all over the world. And it does beg the same kind of questions. I'm sure some of those persons who have not done so well in their papers or as well as they thought in terms of their presentations, and maybe 1 or 2 who may not have even been successful and may have had to redo the paper. They've had the same concerns about how is the grading done, is it heavily discounted, and so on. And from my experiences, particularly with the Brits, they tend to be that way. They tend to discount heavily from time to time. And I remember I'm talking from a student perspective now, because I've done UK courses as well as American courses, as well as Canadian courses. And so I understand that completely. And oftentimes that appears to be the case. The problem is you cannot go to find out the nature of the discount and why it was discounted so heavily. But that is a potential issue. If it's of any constellation at all, the Brits have been known from my father was doing external accounting examinations back in 1940 something to be very difficult in their grading schedules, very unlike the Americans or Canadians, okay, who tend to be a little easier, quote unquote, in how they mark papers. While the American might overlook certain grammatical, spelling, structural, and stuff like that, the British examiner may not potentially necessarily do that. Okay, and this is just some historical stuff that students forever and ever and ever have concluded about the bloody Brits. That's one of the reasons why we call them the bloody Brits. They tend to be very meticulous, very picky about stuff, even right down to a full stop. If they see a sentence with a full stop, depending on who's marking that, they might say, bloody hell. Don't they know a full stop should go there? Something like that. So yeah, unfortunately, especially for external examinations, we're stuck with that phenomena as students. I can say that because I can speak from both sides of the fence as a student, as an examiner, and somebody who's marked papers for the Brits, for students from just about every jurisdiction you can think about. It's one of those things that, yeah, unfortunately, quote unquote, lies out of our control. And again, this is not unique to the Brits. They just tend to be a little, quote unquote, difficult, perceptively anyway, in the grading systems, as opposed to, say, the Americans or the Canadians or some other jurisdiction in the world. And so the best you can do to deal with that is make sure you answer your question completely, because I've seen reviews come back from other British examinations, GRCs and others, where they've said things like students gave a lot of knowledge information, but didn't always answer the question. They gave a lot of quotations, they did a lot of research, they provided a lot of facts, but they didn't always answer the question completely that they may have thought they did. But in hindsight, if you really look at the response and then look at the question, sometimes they miss important aspects of the question. That's another thing you have to be aware of. You can give a full and complete answer in your opinion, but when the examiner looks at the full context of your answer that you feel is complete, and then they compare that to the question, some of them might find inconsistencies in the examiner's opinion, which can result in loss of points and so on. So that is, and they don't come back necessarily and say what the details are. They just discover it and you just suffer the consequences, so to speak. All right. So I would say again, every paper that you have to do, this one and any more that you have to do in the future, follow all the rules. And when you give a complete answer, so to speak, because and like you said, you got a good grade, but you figured you could have gotten more. And that's always a potential. And maybe the reason why you didn't, in some examiner's opinion, might be something that you missed in their opinion that you didn't really think about as a student preparing a complete answer. So that is always a possibility. But in your case, I would say, and for everybody else, whatever you did in paper one to get that great grade that could have been better, do that again, and anything extra that you need to do that might get you the extra points in this particular assignment. Okay. One of the key things, especially students who did not do as well as they thought they would, maybe they thought they did a great paper and got 50 something or 60 something, and they're like, man, what happened? A lot of times it's not the little things, it's maybe you missed something in terms of your interpretation of the question. Please, whatever you do, try not to misinterpret any of the questions, because that will cost you significant points, no matter how much you write, no matter how well you write it. It can be well written, full of facts, full of references, full of grammatically correct, spelling correct, structurally correct. But if you misinterpret the question in any way, you could lose significant credit for that question, which is unfortunate, but it happens. Okay, so be careful with that. I've seen students write great answers to a particular question. The only problem was they misunderstood the question. So sometimes they get very little points or none for a great answer to if only that was the question. So be careful with that. All right. Thank you for raising that as well. 2 or 3 very important things to remember going into your second paper. All right, for sure. Be very meticulous. They are. And whatever you feedback you got, do all that and then double check and double check. Look at your answer and look at that question again 5 times. Let somebody know who might have a little insight. Look, say, read this question and read my answers and tell me, am I answering this bloody question if you have to? Because sometimes we are convinced we answered it. Just like certain answers in normal examinations. I thought I answered that correctly. And then when the answer comes, I think, well, kiss my foot. I thought I answered that correctly. Come to find out you really didn't. You just kind of missed the boat. Okay, so be careful. All right. Any other questions as significant or anything else as those? Anybody else has any questions that came back in terms of what you saw from assignment 1? Because those that were raised already are very significant. And if you guys follow through on the responses that you heard this morning on those, you should be okay. God forbid. Once you do that, make sure you interpret the questions properly, write a full answer, check your grammar, your thought flows, your paragraphing, your spelling, all that stuff. You should be okay. The rest of it, you have absolutely no control of, unfortunately, given who is grading your paper. So everything that you have control over, control the hell out of them. Because after that, it's no longer in your control. Unfortunately, that's just the nature of international examinations everywhere. All right. If there are no other concerns directly, remember, if you think of something while you're doing your paper and you want to raise a question with me about it, please, you can send me an email. I will be happy to respond. If you cannot or have not thought of anything other than what we've covered this morning. If you can't think of anything right away, I can understand, because those questions that were raised already pretty much cover most of the kinds of problems students have. So if you took note of them and you apply them effectively, you should be okay, unless you just messed up a question or two for some reason. And that happens to some of us from time to time. So be very careful. Okay? I noticed also that these questions in assignment 2 are very short. But don't let shortness fool you. They may be
Nothing, baby.
They may be short, but they are loaded. For example, look at question 1, because you only have 3 questions. But there's no such thing as only 3. These questions will beat you to death. Some papers have questions that take up 2 and 3 pages out of 100%. These 3 questions only take up a small space, but they're still out of 100%, and they are loaded. Don't presume because it's an itsy bitsy, like question 1 or 2 sentences. Imagine that. But it's worth 35 points. That means for the Brits, man, you need to make sure you understand that question and find out everything you need to find out from your text, and otherwise, what you need to answer the question. What would be your initial risk rating of the accounts of Emmanuel Santos? Man, well, you have to go into the whole risk rating exercise and keep referring to Emmanuel Santos and the situation. And you need to know right away that the question of risk deals with nationality, which is jurisdictional. Mexican right off the top. They didn't put Mexico there by accident. Mexico has serious implications for real life and your question. So it's a jurisdictional issue for Mexico and all the problems connected to that jurisdiction. Okay? The nature of the business type. Notice where this company was incorporated, Delaware. That has risk issues. If you're not aware of the risk issues in Delaware, go find out about Delaware. Delaware doesn't raise too many compliance issues. So all kinds of people are floating around in Delaware, including Mexican cartels. And look where the farming interest in Latin America. Who would help get the truth out of Latin Americans? So I don't want you to assume that question 1 is just a question on basic risk issues, and so you can come up with little itsy bitsy stuff and say you're done. You need to find out all the risk issues, and then you need to connect it to Emmanuel's situation, this client that you have. Notice the source of wealth, family money. Man, what's the risk issue there? That's like saying you won money at the local the local gambling house in Nassau. I've seen cases where persons came to the bank and to deposit on 3 separate occasions in 1 month, 20,000 suspicious transactions being reported, and 20,000 1 week, 30,000 next week, and 15,000 the next week. And the bank says, well, what is the source of your funds? They said, one of the local gambling houses. Okay, one of the local gambling houses. How are we going to prove it? Well, the only best way you can prove it is to get a certified, properly notarized copy of a declaration from the gambling house. And even that may serve to give some credence to it, but even then, if the person who won the money is the friend of the person who owns the gambling house, they'll have anybody send a letter and certify it. We still don't know. Boy, I just get this money from a deal, but I need a certification from you. Use my boy. Just sign this letter and stamp it. Again, my lawyer who's a friend. So source of wealth, family money, same kind of problem. Family money with family money from where? The cartel or legitimate business? If it's legitimate,
Excuse me.
yes, question.
Excuse me, Mr. Yes, what I realized with this is that while answering question 1,
Yep.
you it's I don't know, it must be an art to this, because while answering question 1, you kind of merge on answering question 2 as well. But you know, you have to keep those 2 separate, because the questions that you're going to ask about, what about the family money, or you know, that's really what question 2 is asking about, the CDD.
To some extent, yes.
Yeah, so so that means that you're either double up on information, or you have to find a whole bunch of it and know how to separate it.
Absolutely. That's the whole nature of the questions coming from the Brits. That's what they do. All right. There's a correlation, but you can't mix them up. And don't try getting like, well, in your answer, well, here's some student might put in the answer. It appears as if a lot of the things in question 2 has to do with question 1. Man, they don't want to hear that. You have to answer them independently, even if there are some similarities. You still have to apply the information and the research to the question at hand. Absolutely. Okay. But we know that question 1 deals primarily with what?
Risk rating.
Risk. Yeah, risk issues. Risk rating, they say, but not only risk rating, be careful. They say to your initial risk rating, that means you need to come up with all kinds of discussion about how to risk rate clients. And that somewhere in there, you're going to be talking about risk in itself without rambling on about unnecessary risk-related issues. But the point is, you have to deal with the issue of risk and how to risk rate clients and what is the criteria that you should use and how you should apply that criteria to a Santos group. That's what that first question is about. And you need to answer that in some detail. And since these questions are evenly spaced, 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, and you have 3,000 words, is that your limit?
That's the minimum.
What's the maximum?
3,500.
Okay, 3,500. So that means you have an average of 1,100 words to apply to each one and to be thorough with it. So I suggest when you're doing your initial draft, that's why you need to start this thing early. Okay, you just write everything you need to write for 1, 2, and 3, and it might end up being 6,000 words. Kiss my foot. I need to get down to 3,500. That's okay. It's easier to get down than to try and go up. So write all you need to know, write about what you think your answer should be completely, and then you go back and take out what you think you can take out to get to your 3,500. That's what you have to do. That crap takes time. I know you know that. And you have to do the same thing for paper 2. Okay, so be careful. Number 2, the customer due diligence support team wish to make further inquiries about the potential client prior to onboarding. What information would you expect them to obtain and how might it be acquired? And yes, you have to make sure those are 2. See, risk rating and CDD might have a little overlapping, but they are 2 completely different and significant functions in terms of determining whether the client should be onboarded. Is 2 related to 1? I mean, sorry, is 2 related to the same client?
Yes.
How do you know?
says the customer due diligence support team wish to make further inquiries about the potential client, and Santos is the potential client they're talking about
Okay, how do you know he's a potential client?
because they have him in the heading.
Okay, because they have him in the heading.
And
Okay.
it's the word further, make further inquiries.
Yes. So you see, all of a sudden, we have to nitpick to make sure that we're not misunderstanding and we're connecting properly. See that one word. And sometimes students go way off because they miss the word further. Believe it or not. Because if you miss the word further, then you're going to come up with some independent answers not connected to the Santos. And God forbid where that will end. But they give a great full answer on CDD. Just that they don't connect it to further. Santos. Okay. And 3, if you decided to onboard, say, Emmanuel Santos, what does that tell you? That your decision on further is what? Correct. It is related. That's why you don't start anything until you read everything. Because if you just answer 1 without looking at 2 and 3, you might come up with 3 independent answers. And then when you just kiss my foot, these are related. Then you have to go back to square 1. Or worse, you've already submitted it. Big time answers that in and of themselves are great, but they don't connect. It's called missing the boat. That stinks, even in examination and especially in examination setting. All right. So if you decided to onboard this guy after 1 and 2, after doing all that stuff in 1 and 2 as a client, but after 12 months, further information came to light that confirmed he was a criminal and was in fact laundering the proceeds of crime, what consequences might result for the firm. So you need to go into all the risk issues that the firm will now face, potentially, from the regulators and the law and otherwise, and make sure that your answer is complete in terms of the consequences that the firm can potentially face. And so a whole lot of your response has to do with consequences, from reputational issues to suspending the license, to losing the license, to being fined by regulators, and so on. All of the potential consequences, which means you have to go back into your text and into the world of information and find out what these consequences might be in such a setting, and then come up and then structure it within the context of your question so that you answer completely as you can. Must remember, in all that says, Santos is still your client. After you discuss all the consequences, what will you do with Santos? Will you keep him as a client? And if you do, what are the consequences? And if you decide not to keep him as a client, are there any consequences for that? So, I don't envy you guys. This one is going to be just as challenging as the other one. For those of you who may not have begun, please begin today and work on it every day until July the 4th, because you have to put this whole thing together. You have to go back and review this whole thing. You have to make sure that you're answering the questions correctly and fully. You have to make sure that your structure, grammar, and spelling are right. You have to go back and make sure that you're answering the question correctly, that there's no unnecessary overlapping from one question to the next. And you have to make sure that you're answering the question correctly and that you're not interpreting it. I said it 3 or 4 times on purpose, because that's how you have to keep looking at it until you're done and until you make your final submission, just to make sure you're on the right track. Okay? All right. Any other questions, thoughts, or concerns? Remember, if you think of any, feel free to send me an email and I should be happy to respond if it will give you some further insight on this crazy thing that you have to do. All right. I know that was another. I don't envy you guys at all, but good luck in doing that. I hope everybody in this room has started the paper already. Don't let those three little itsy bitsy questions seemingly fool you. They are loaded, and those bloody Brits will be looking for complete answers. And I say complete in inverted commas, because we've already had that discussion. All you can do is make it as completely as you can, done as you can, and trying to not misinterpret any of the questions. I've seen students in my experience who gave great answers but didn't answer the question. Please don't be one of those students. That happens. And you feel good about your answers, and your answers were great if only they had answered the question. That is sometimes one of the sneakiest situations of all, leaving students baffled. I did a complete set of answers or answer. What happened? And if only you could get in and find out, you'll find out sometimes, my God, I didn't answer the question. I misinterpreted the question. I misunderstood the question or questions. I thought surely that was not the case. Okay? So be careful. Don't get stuck with that. All right, so on to Unit 13, which now talks about, Unit 12 was, man, super loaded with all kinds of crazy stuff that compliance and MLR people need to know, that even employees and persons in general need to know. And so now we move over to Unit 13, where we talk about how do we manage the AML CFT policy. We all know by now that there must be a policy. Companies, financial institutions are fined tens of millions of dollars for just not having a policy. That's how serious it is. Many of them are fined millions and millions of dollars for not updating their policy. Many are fined millions and millions of dollars and brought under the gun because the policy is not relevant to the organization. How about that? Some organizations just cut and paste policies. Just find a policy somewhere on the internet, change the name, and say, this is our AML CFT policy. But it's not. When the regulator looks at it and looks at the organization, the information is not consistent with that organization. Strange things happen in AML CFT compliance. Okay? It is an amazing world out there in AML CFT compliance. And so for those of you who work for financial institutions, even if you're not a CO, MLR officer, or when you become one, or connected in any way, or part of internal audit, which is connected to it in any way, and so on, then you will discover all the things we just discussed and more about the dynamic world. So now we're into the management of AML. And this is where a lot of firms fall down, find themselves fighting with regulators, find themselves being fined gazillions of dollars. Okay? The same firms who said they couldn't give salary increases that year, they spend 10 times that amount just on fines because of policy violations alone. And other violations, but since we're talking about policy here, policy violations. Some of those firms were warned already, even before the fines by regulators, and still didn't do it. So they're deliberate, some of them, in their efforts for some reason. Regulators have complained bitterly over and over. We've gone in, told them what the problems are, give them a chance to fix it. When we go in a year or two later, they still haven't fixed it. Imagine that. All right. So why are we in this unit? We are in this unit so that we can look at the AML CFT policy in general and to see how we are required to meet the legislative and regulatory requirements for this policy. Every regulatory requirement says at the very beginning there must be an AML CFT policy, period. It's amazing in 2021, in 21st century, firms are still violating this requirement in one form or another. How do we implement the policy? Another challenge for many firms. A major challenge for many compliance officers. Okay. Does the policy or handbook have all the information in it it's supposed to have in order for the firm to be effectively run, such that anybody picking it up will know exactly what is required. Another problem we continue to face. Okay? So this policy issue, and one of the reasons why firms oftentimes do not like policies or updated policies, because policies put you on the chopping block. Policies make you put in it what you're supposed to do, and if you don't do it, somebody can go back, like a regulator, a staff member, anybody, and say, but the policy says. And many organizations don't want, especially senior management people, sometimes, depending on who they are and what their agenda is, they don't want any document that you can bring back to them and say, you said. Because now they have to act on it. And depending on what kind of firm you work for, sometimes they don't want to act on it. So they deliberately leave it out. All right. So now we start with our discussion. Aha. Speaking about question 1, I wonder if this has anything to do with question 1 somewhere that we just discussed for your assignment. Because from what I could see in this section, it says, the topic says, formulating a risk-based strategy and policy. I wonder if that has anything to do with your question 1 for Santos and company for this risk rating. I suspect that anybody with their grits so far will think immediately risk rating. Then if this chapter is about policy, then I must say somewhere in my paper that the firm must consult its risk rating policy to see exactly what the requirements are. Somehow you have to build that up and talk about that and work around and add anything else you need to. So let's get it on to see if there's something in this unit that might be helpful to you. Okay, Delisa, are you still there?
Excuse me 1 second, Mr. Wilkinson. Question 1, does this question automatically mean that this gentleman has been on never mind. I answered my own question. Never mind. Thank you.
How do you know you answered your own question?
No, I was gonna say that obviously this is just I don't know if I'm allowed to say this is obviously a high risk client, right? Now I know that the central bank has its own regulations as it relates to risk rating clients and blah blah blah. But also banks has its own risk appetite.
Right.
So I guess what I want to know is where does any company draw the line where, you know, we're not going to onboard this client? Does it end with sanctions? Where does it end? When does a company decide and they're not gonna? I've never had to risk rate a client. I've never done this before. So when does a company decide that they just don't want to onboard this client? Because this Santos gentleman, I wouldn't onboard him, but you know, I think there's a lot of Mr. Santos in the world. So where do you draw the line?
Yeah, and many of the Mr. Santos are already in the organization. And many of the Santos started off as being low risk. And then later on, after monitoring and checking, you find out, or hearing information, you find out, like Santos, that they're now in the high risk category. So yeah, in your case, for example, you will want, when I say your case, I mean you and your colleagues, you will want to consult the risk rating requirements of the regulator. You want to consult to see, to say at some point that given the risk rating requirements of the regulator, that the firm should have similar risk rating requirements relative to the organization. Then you may want to investigate to find out what are the standard risk rating requirements for a typical firm. See, that's where all this work come in, and then you compare the requirements of the central bank regulator or the regulators to your research on the stipulations that typical organizations have for risk rating, what methods do they use, high, medium, low, what's the criteria, things like that. And then you have to build your answer based on those things. That's why I say this thing is not an overnight affair, absolutely. And for many of you who have not had the hands-on experience, it's going to be a little more challenging because now you're just responding from a purely academic perspective. Okay, so yeah, that is the challenge, and that's what you're going to have to put together to give a complete answer in each of those cases, by all means. But certainly explore all the variables from a regulator's perspective, from the commercial perspective of what other financial institutions are doing as far as risk rating is concerned. Then you look at Santos and see whether Santos' case conforms to that or not, whether or not that should have been taken on in the first place. Because once you do your research on what the central bank requires, and what the other financial institutions are requiring, then you look at Santos and say, wait a minute, this account should not have been on board in the first place because of blah, blah, blah. And then you'll be able to speak to that further down in your question to Santos. Okay, but yes, that is the approach that you will certainly have to take. Okay,
Okay, thank you.
no problem. Okay, Delisa, let's kick in to see if we can get some information today on the risk-based strategy and policy that each organization should have today, financial institution. Delisa, are you there? Okay, Delisa has gone off to have coffee. All right, while we wait for Delisa to come back, Ivania, are you there?
Yes, sir, I am.
Okay, Ivania, great. Why don't you pick up with this important topic in Unit 13 right at the very beginning? Any strategy. You see it on page 486?
Give me 1 second. You said any
Yeah, the very first page in Unit 13.
formulating a risk-based strategy?
Yes.
Okay. Any strategy for protecting a business against exposure to money laundering or terrorism financing must begin with the formulation and adoption of an AML CFT policy that is approved at the most senior level. This policy serves as a clear, user-friendly statement of corporate intent that can be communicated internally to employees at all levels and externally to customers, regulatory authorities, and law enforcement bodies. Such policies serve as a valuable indicator of effective corporate governance.
Let me say this before you go on, Ivania. That is a very strong opening statement. And certainly in your answer on risk rating, if we need to have a policy for AML CFT, risk rating should fall within that policy somewhere. So clearly something needs to be said about the firm having a risk rating policy to govern and why it needs to have that risk rating policy in terms of its governance. So again, you'll find that some of this stuff you have to extract it. That's the kind of stuff that those guys, but see if you just give them a chunk of information from the text like that, they're like, okay, fine, this probably came from the text anyway. But you go into the chunk and you pull out like relevant pieces, like there should be a risk rating policy so that the risk issues can be properly governed and so on. So you're using the same concepts, but you're applying it in the context of your question, okay? That is another technique that is very useful, rather than just dropping chunks of information or facts, which may relate to the question in some ways, but does not have any interpretive power. Be careful. All right, keep going.
An organization's attitude towards combating money laundering is increasingly viewed as an indicative of the ethics with which it conducts its business. The pressure on organizations to adopt effective AML CFT strategies may be seen as the modern equivalent of the pressure brought to bear on the manufacturing industry in the 1980s by environmentalists. An appropriate statement of corporate intent in the form of AML CFT policy, supplemented with meaningful and effective procedures, allow an organization to communicate its attitude clearly. Supervisors will normally consider the policy to be a key piece of evidence when assessing how senior managers are complying with their individual and group responsibilities for the prevention of money laundering and terrorism financing. The money laundering reporting officer, MLRO, or equivalent accountable senior manager should promote to management the benefits of a policy and play a key role in its formulation. The MLRO or equivalent should have a vested interest in the adoption of a policy that will help provide him or her with the mandate for undertaking the role properly. 2, the need for a group-wide program. Financial Action Task Force, FATF, recommendation 18 relating to internal control states that financial institutions should be required to implement programs against money laundering and terrorist financing. Financial groups should be required to implement group-wide programs against money laundering and terrorist financing, including policies and procedures for sharing information within the group for AML CFT purposes. A simple guide to these terms is contained in the New Zealand AML CFT program guideline. Policies set out the expectations, standards, and behavior in a business. Procedures are more detailed and set out day-to-day operations. Controls are the tools that management uses to ensure the business complies with policies and procedures. FATF's interpretive note to recommendation 18 provides the following guidance. 1, financial institutions programs against money laundering and terrorist financing should include A, the development of internal policies, procedures, and controls, including appropriate compliance management arrangements and adequate screening procedures to ensure high standards when hiring employees. B, an ongoing employee training program. And C, an independent audit function to test the system.
So you can see right away, you can see right away the basic foundational issues. Even if you don't have all the details yet, these kinds of things put forth by FATF are very foundational, and they were successful in getting most key jurisdictions of the world to come up with legislative and policy positions on these things. So just about any financial institution you walk into, if you pick up a manual or policy of some kind, these should be the building blocks of that policy. I don't care what's in it. If these 3 things alone do not jump out at you, I'm not saying the policy is inadequate, but it certainly is not sufficient or complete without these key issues. Okay, keep going.
2, the type and extent of measures to be taken should the appropriate having regard to the risk of money laundering and terrorist financing and the size of the business. 3, compliance management arrangements should be included in the appointment of a compliance officer and at the management level. Where there is a financial group, the program should be applicable to all branches and majority-owned subsidiaries. The interpretive note states, in the case of their foreign operations, where the minimum AML CFT requirement of the host country are less strict than those of the home country, financial institutions should be required to ensure that their branches and majority-owned subsidiaries in host countries implement the requirement of the home country to the extent that the host country laws and regulations permit. If the host country does not permit the proper implementation of the measures above, financial groups should apply appropriate additional measures to manage the money laundering and terrorist financing risks and inform their home supervisors. 2.1.
in other words, what if and all that crazy language, just saying if you have a parent company and you have subsidiaries and branches and all this stuff, everybody has to be on the same page with regards to policy issues. There should not be any level of incongruency between the groups, which as well is a common problem as well. Because a lot of times when branches and subsidiaries in outlying areas, other countries, other cultures and all this kind of stuff, the policies can get misconstrued and become inconsistent. And so that in itself is a major AML-CFT challenge for those organizations that have subsidiaries and branches worldwide, right? But doesn't matter, they expected to somehow bring them all into some level of congruence or agreement or suffer the consequences. All right, keep going.
Issues for consideration. Where an organization does operate globally or has a presence in more than one jurisdiction, it is good practice to adopt a group anti-money laundering policy, which as a minimum complies with the highest standards to be found among the countries within which it operates. Some jurisdictions already require this to be done. Example, Switzerland and Germany. Choosing between the AML-CFT frameworks of different jurisdictions, sometimes known as jurisdiction shopping or regulatory arbitrage.
Yes, arbitrage.
By rejecting business in one jurisdiction and accepting it in another within the same group is short-sighted and places at risk the reputation of the group as a whole.
Yes.
While the laws of each jurisdiction in which an organization has a presence may differ slightly, the risk of being exposed to criminally derived property are the same. Group standards. Group standards set up firm's AML-CFT handbook, see section 6.3 below, must be supplemented by countries' annexes that indicate specific requirements and vary those standards as appropriate. Failure to do so can lead to
censure
following an inspection by a host country regulator.
Absolutely.
The group-wide program should be appropriate to the business of the branches and wholly owned subsidiaries. Although the program should include policies and procedures for sharing the information that is required to manage the group's AML-CFT risks, adequate safeguards should be in place to ensure the confidentiality and use of the information exchanged.
Thank you very much, Ivania. I think you've set the stage for the policy so far. Notice we start off with there should be a policy for AML-CFT, period. If you have branches and subsidiaries, everybody has to be on the same page. If there are jurisdictional differences, sort them out, get it together, make the adjustments so that when the regulators come in, they know that you've taken steps to identify the differences and to make it as congruent as possible. They have no problem with jurisdictional differences. The problem is when you don't sort to deal with them and work them out and make them clear within the policies and procedures, right? That is the point. And many firms still suffer from not doing these things. They're like, man, they're in China, the hell with it. The head office is in Canada, we'll get to it when we get to it. And the subsidiary or branch in China, they're doing their own thing. And the Chinese have their own cultural and regulatory issues. And somehow you have to find a way to make them gel. That's fine. Nobody has a problem with those incongruencies or differences. The problem is when you ignore these things and seek to do nothing policy-wise. You cannot have that. All right. So Jensen, why don't you finish us up for today by picking up with section 3?
Sure. Okay, so content of a policy. Hold 1 second for me. 1 second. The content of an AML CFT policy requires very careful consideration. Too often, businesses pay external advisors to draft policies that are then adopted at board level without being sufficiently tailored to the firm. Such policies will not be fit for purpose and may result in enforcement action.
Enforcement
In
action.
formulating,
Sorry, enforcement
sorry.
action by who? Anyone? Who will enforce any action against the firm? The police?
I'm guessing the regulator or
Regulators, yes. The police do not get involved unless something criminal is happening. This thing about policy has to do with the legal requirements as far as regulators are concerned. So if you come up with some internet policy that does not fit purpose because it's not connected, that's some consultant coming in, go on the internet, change the name, change a few things, charge you $1 million and go home rich. And still, when the regulators come in, they find that there are a host of inconsistencies within the policy versus that organization. Okay, keep going.
in formulating a policy, the MLRO or equivalent must first decide what the firm wishes to achieve by its adoption and consider a variety of factors, including the nature, scale, and complexity of its business, the diversity of its operations, including geographical diversity, the volume and size of its transactions, and the degree of risk associated with each area of its operation. As a bare minimum, an MLRO or equivalent will wish to achieve compliance with primary and secondary legislation and best practice guidance, including all procedural obligations, cooperation with law enforcement and investigating authorities where necessary, respect for customer confidentiality, which should be breached only when necessary, clearly defined responsibilities and accountabilities for money laundering prevention within the business, a statement of the organization's willingness to provide sufficient resources for money laundering prevention, a statement as to the parameters within which an organization is willing to operate, which defines what business an organization will, and more importantly, will not accept. The acceptance of new business subject to compliance with appropriate CDD and risk assessment procedures. The continuation of existing business only where such business complies with appropriate CDD, risk assessment, and monitoring procedures. A statement of the firm's approach to the education, training, and awareness maintenance of all staff and management, and recognition by staff of the importance of prompt internal reporting of their suspicions. Statement of the firm's attitude towards persistent non-compliance with AML CFT procedures, and a positive manifestation of the prevailing cultural attitude that the organization wishes to create towards money laundering prevention. A risk mitigation approach.
Pretty exhausting list already, isn't it? And it's not the end. I'm just saying that at this point again, so you can have a full appreciation that this thing is not an overnight affair. Okay, this is serious stuff that sometimes takes years even to put into the proper perspective. A lot of blood, sweat, and tears fighting with each other and regulators and others, and in some cases ending up in fines and other impositions and enforcement, all to get it to where we want it to be in terms of how the policy should be established for each and every financial institution. Okay, keep going.
A risk mitigation approach involves circulating a summary of the firm's approach to assessing and managing its money laundering and terrorism financing risk, allocation of responsibilities to specific persons and functions, circulating a summary of the firm's procedures for carrying out appropriate identification and monitoring checks in line with its risk-based approach, and circulating a summary of the appropriate monitoring arrangements in place to ensure that all staff are aware of the firm's policies and procedures. The list of components of a generic policy are valuable in providing a framework for the individual policy of a financial services business. Nonetheless, it must be appreciated that a policy must be tailored to the specific nature of an organization's business, its products, services, and customer base. Fighting crime and terrorism should be a part of a firm's ethical goals. The policy should provide clearly stated objectives for achieving these goals. When formulating the policy, the MLRO or equivalent and senior management must remain aware that reporting obligations in many jurisdictions apply to involvement with any criminal property and terrorist acts. The AML-CFT policy cannot, therefore, be formulated in isolation from policies for preventing and detecting other financial crime, and the overall risks must be assessed and managed holistically. The UK's Joint Money Laundering Steering Group guidance notes advise that, from a practical perspective, therefore, firms should consider how best they should assess and manage their overall exposure to financial crime. This does not mean that fraud, money laundering, and terrorism financing prevention must be addressed by a single function within a firm. There will, however, need to be close liaison between those responsible for each activity.
Jensen, stick a pin. I have a question I want to ask you before you go on.
Sure.
Now, I noticed when you read that UK's GMLSG, you just kind of spilled out what that acronym was without thinking. I wonder how that happened. Was that an accident?
Not necessarily.
What caused you to be able to spill out what that acronym is?
Well, I believe we came across it a few times before in previous units, if I remember correctly.
And you just remembered it, correct?
Yes.
Yes. Knowledge is an incredible thing. Coming across stuff is an incredible thing. Being young and energetic and remembering stuff is another incredible thing, isn't it?
Agreed.
Being
Yes, it was familiar.
conscientious, yeah, being conscientious about what you're doing is another incredible thing. Because all of a sudden, had you not even bothered with this whole thing, when you see JMLSG, you'd be like, to hell with it. What the hell is that? That's the beauty of it all. All right, keep going. Statement for all, by the way, not just Jensen. Keep going.
Okay. It is always open to a business to exceed these minimum compliance principles by deciding to implement procedures or customer acceptance practices that exceed the minimum requirements laid down by the laws of a particular jurisdiction. As discussed in Module 4, Unit 10, Section 10.6, where an organization has a presence in more than one jurisdiction, it is sensible for it to adopt a group AML-CFT policy, which, as a minimum, complies with the standards of the most stringent national framework with which it has to comply. Regulatory arbitrage should be avoided. National laws may vary, but the risk of being exposed to criminally derived property are the same in each country, and the global efforts by international organizations are becoming more and more effective, meaning that standards are leveling around the world. The nature of the international financial services market means that it is possible to inadvertently conduct a transaction using a branch of your organization where money laundering controls are stricter than in your own
Thank you
country.
very much.
Consider the following.
We'll stop there, Jensen, and next week we'll pick up that little case study and move into the rest of Unit 13 and whatever interesting things that we need to look at in Unit 14. So far, it seems like we have covered an avalanche of critical information. Unfortunately, that is true, and that is the whole purpose of size that you can carry with you not only for your papers and your academic pursuits, but you can carry a whole lot of this stuff with you, like how Jensen is carrying a JLMLG crazy stuff in his head already, can't even get it out. That's the whole idea, that some of these things will stick, and wherever you see these things occurring in your professional life, even if you're not an MLRO or CO yet, compliance issues occur in work, and whole point I'm making. So don't get stuck on MLRO CEO. That's only if you become one of them. But if you don't, you still have compliance responsibilities and wherever you are. For sure, You still have ethical responsibilities wherever you are. And wherever you are should have a policy. Same policies we're discussing. You don't call them AMFCFT, but it should have a policy governing that organization. And if it doesn't, then they are not compliant with good governance practices. Doesn't have to be a financial institution. That's the point. All right. So we'll stop there today. Next week we'll pick up and finish off the rest of the blah blah blah. Please, it's almost July, the whatever it is, your deadline. If you haven't begun yet, God forbid, begin as soon as you sign out of this class today. I work the entire weekend and every day until it's time your paper is done. If you've already begun, go ahead and fine tune that paper. Do not remember all the things we said today about the information that you should be putting in your submission. Try and cover all of the relevant areas. Do not leave anything to chance. Write down all the things we talked about in terms of presenting your paper, none the least of which, do not misinterpret your question. While you're writing your answers, keep looking at your question. Ask yourself, am I answering this question? Am I still answering this question? Have I not wandered off into the wilderness somewhere? Students make that mistake all the time. And what happens is, in their minds, they have presented a complete and full set of answers, and then at the end of the day, sometimes they miss the boat because of interpretation issues. So don't do that. All right. Good luck in all this crazy stuff you have to do. Remember, I'm an email away if something pops up that you'd like to get a response to, whether it's regard to your paper or otherwise. Feel free to send me an email. All right. Any other questions before we break? Okay. Remember, the pandemic is not over. Remember with Boris Johnson in the UK, they have a whole new strain from India, they say. So they're back in lockdown for another month while behemoths are partying and fish fry, understand, acting as if there's no pandemic. A couple of people have gotten their vaccination, so they feel invincible now, that nothing is going to happen. Well, we have all kinds of different stories. We don't know for sure. Maybe we need to risk rate this situation. See, that question again, risk rate. All of a sudden now, risk rating doesn't only apply to financial institutions. It applies to countries and jurisdictions as well, by the way. So don't get stuck into a box thinking that those things only apply to financial institutions. They have all kinds of implications. All right. In any event, stay safe, and I'll see you guys next week, Saturday, when we'll finish up governance issues, and you can move on. Remember, I've said it a couple of times. I know I sound like a scorch record by now. If you haven't begun, start today. Don't watch church on TV tomorrow while you work. Don't let anybody invite you anywhere. Tell them you're busy, unless it's life and death, children to look after and all that stuff. Put the baby on your knee and write stuff. Start right away. If you haven't started, and if you have, keep on trucking. All right, good luck, and I'll see you guys next week.